The air was heavy with whispers of ancient power, a power that trembled between fear and reverence. In the dim, flickering glow of candles, a figure stood before a slab of unformed clay. His hands trembled not with doubt but with the weight of responsibility. This was not mere art. It was a conversation with something greater, something that existed on the edges of the tangible and the divine. Long before this moment, tales circulated through villages and towns. Stories told of humans shaping clay into a being that could stand, walk, and serve. The clay, ordinary and silent, would spring to life with the utterance of sacred words. It was a creation not just of hands, but of will. Some called it a protector, others a servant of the divine. But everyone knew it was no ordinary act, it was a dangerous one. The beginning of this legend was not recorded in ink but etched in the collective memory of a people who faced the unrelenting storms of history. Persecution chased them from one corner of the earth to another. When the darkness felt too overwhelming, they looked inward and upward. It wasn't just the heavens they sought, it was the wisdom hidden in their sacred traditions. And from this union of desperation and hope, the Golem was born. In hushed voices, rabbis spoke of the power of words. To the world, words might seem fragile, mere vibrations of air. But to those who understood, they were bridges between the seen and unseen. They recited verses, each syllable trembling with meaning, shaping not just thoughts but reality. This was the secret of the Golem: words could breathe life into the lifeless. The story of its creation didn't begin with arrogance. It began with the need to protect. When no human arms were strong enough, when no shield could stop the horrors that swept through their communities, the Golem became a whispered hope. Clay was chosen not for its simplicity but for its connection to the earth. It was humble, malleable, and yet, in its plainness, it held a profound mystery. Clay was the substance of humanity itself. Legends say the first Golem was formed in a time of dire need. The skies over the Jewish ghettos were often darkened, not by storms, but by the looming threats of those who sought to harm. In one of these stories, the villagers were tormented by relentless accusations, their lives hanging by a thread. It was during such a night, when the stars seemed to flicker like dying embers, that the Golem was said to have been born. A rabbi, known for his wisdom and connection to the divine, decided that the cries of his people could no longer go unanswered. He stayed up through the long hours of the night, preparing. The air in his small room was thick with the scent of wax and parchment, the words of sacred texts swirling around him. He wasn't creating something out of pride. His heart carried the weight of every plea, every tear. His hands moved over the clay with a tenderness that could only come from someone who understood suffering. The clay figure lay on the floor, cold and lifeless. But in its stillness, it radiated potential. The rabbi stepped back, his voice breaking as he uttered the sacred name of God. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. And then, the figure stirred. The first movements were slight, a finger twitching, a chest rising as if taking its first breath. The room seemed to tremble as the lifeless form transformed into something more. The rabbi stood there, not in triumph, but in awe. What he had brought forth was not just a servant, but a being that stood as a testament to human resilience and faith. The Golem did not speak. It did not need to. Its silence carried a weight that words could not. It walked among the people, its steps heavy and deliberate, its presence a shield against those who sought to harm. Children looked at it with wide eyes, torn between fear and fascination. Adults, though, understood what it truly meant. The Golem was both a savior and a reminder of the lengths to which they would go to protect their community. Yet, this power was not without its dangers. The Golem, for all its strength, was not human. It had no soul, no moral compass. It obeyed commands, but it did not understand the subtleties of mercy or restraint. In its eyes, justice was a blade, sharp and unforgiving. The very thing that protected them could also become a threat if wielded carelessly. The stories never shy away from this duality. They tell of times when the Golem's strength became too much to bear. In one tale, it grew uncontrollable, its actions no longer aligned with the intentions of its creator. The same hands that had shaped it were forced to undo their work. With heavy hearts, the words that had given it life were reversed, and the clay returned to the earth from which it came. These tales are not just about clay and words. They are about the human spirit's desperate yearning for safety and justice. The golem stands as a symbol of what happens when creation teeters on the edge of divinity and destruction. It is both a miracle and a warning, a reflection of humanity's greatest hopes and deepest fears. The room was quiet, save for the scratching of a quill across parchment. A lone candle flickered, its light casting long shadows on the walls. In the stillness, the rabbi's gaze lingered on the letters he had just inscribed. Each stroke was deliberate, each letter shimmering with a significance that went far beyond language. These were not ordinary words. They were vessels, carrying the weight of creation itself. The air seemed to hum as if it, too, recognized the magnitude of what was taking place. In the mystical heart of Jewish tradition, there existed a belief that everything, every star in the sky, every blade of grass, every breath of wind, was born from words. Not just spoken words, but divine combinations, woven together with an intention so precise it echoed the voice of God. This was the essence of the Kabbalah, a sacred, hidden wisdom that peered into the very blueprint of existence. The Kabbalists spoke of the Sphirot, 10 emanations through which the infinite light of the Creator flowed into the finite world. These were not merely abstract ideas, they were alive, pulsing with energy and meaning. To the Kabbalists, the universe wasn't random or chaotic. It was a tapestry, intricately woven with threads of divine purpose. And if one could understand these threads, if one could grasp the patterns, they could touch the edges of creation itself. The Golem legend emerged from this understanding, from the belief that humans, created in the image of God, carried a spark of that same creative power. It wasn't arrogance. It was reverence, a trembling acknowledgement of the sacred trust placed in humanity. But this power came with a cost. To even begin to approach it required more than knowledge. It demanded purity of heart, unshakable faith, and a willingness to walk a path filled with both wonder and danger. The creation of a golem was said to begin with clay, shaped into a human form. But the clay was only a vessel. Without the sacred words, it remained lifeless. The words were the key, drawn from the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. This ancient text spoke of the power of letters and numbers, of their ability to form the building blocks of reality. The Kabbalists believed that by combining these letters in specific ways, one could bring forth life, or even reshape the world. One night, beneath a sky laden with stars, a rabbi stood at the edge of a riverbank. He held the Sefer Yetzirah close to his chest, its words already etched into his mind and heart. The river whispered as it flowed, a reminder of the balance he sought to honor. He knelt in the damp earth, his hands sinking into the clay. As he began to shape it, his lips moved in silent prayer. His heart thundered, not with fear, but with the weight of what he was attempting. He was not creating something new. He was merely calling forth what had always been. The letters were etched into the golem's body, precise and deliberate. They were not decorations. They were alive, pulsating with a force that was almost palpable. The rabbi's hands trembled as he wrote the final letter, his breath catching as he uttered the name of God. In that moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind stilled, the river slowed, and for a heartbeat, all of creation held its breath. And then, the golem moved. Its eyes opened, not with the flicker of human emotion, but with a deep, steady awareness. It stood, its massive form casting a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly. The rabbi stepped back, his chest tight with awe. He had invoked the divine, not as a challenge, but as an act of faith. The golem stood as a testament to the power of words, to the sacred connection between the Creator and the created. Yet the Kabbalah warned of the delicate balance that must always be maintained. The golem was a reflection of its creator, shaped not only by his hands, but by his heart. If his intentions were pure, the golem would protect, would serve. But if even a sliver of pride or anger crept into his soul, the golem could become a force of chaos. The Kabbalists understood this better than anyone. They spoke of the dangers of wielding such power, of the thin line between creation and destruction. To create a golem was to step into a space where humanity was both exalted and humbled. It was to touch the divine, knowing that such a touch could either illuminate or consume. The rabbi who had brought the golem to life knew this as well. Each time he commanded it, his voice carried not authority, but supplication. Each word he spoke was a prayer, a reminder of the responsibility he bore. The golem obeyed, its silence a mirror of the rabbi's own inner stillness. Together, they stood as protectors, bound by words that were both powerful and fragile. But the golem was not immortal. Its life was tied to the letters inscribed upon its body. To erase even one letter was to undo the creation, to return the clay to the earth from which it came. The rabbi knew this, too. He understood that the golem was not a tool to be wielded, but a gift to be honored. And when the time came, when its purpose was fulfilled, he would erase those letters, his hand steady even as his heart ached. This was the paradox of the Kabbalah, that in reaching toward the infinite, one must also embrace the finite. The golem, for all its strength, was a reminder of the fragility of life, of the sacredness of creation. It was a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a reflection of a truth too profound to be spoken. And in its silent, towering presence, it carried a message that echoed through the ages, that the greatest power is not in the act of creation itself, but in the humility with which it is approached. The candlelight flickered in the dim study, casting shifting shadows on the ancient scrolls spread across the wooden table. A scholar sat, his fingers tracing the faded ink of words written centuries ago, words that held mysteries he was just beginning to understand. The word golem emerged from the text, its presence quiet yet commanding, as though the parchment itself held its breath. It was not a story, not yet. It was a whisper, a suggestion of something that lay beneath the surface of understanding, waiting to be awakened. The Talmud, vast and intricate, is more than a collection of teachings. It is alive, its passages weaving through time like roots in the earth, connecting generations with a shared pulse. Within these sacred texts, the golem appeared, not as the towering figure of later legends, but as an idea, a concept tethered to the origins of humanity itself. The word golem, unformed, incomplete, carried with it the weight of potential, the shadow of creation before it was touched by the divine. In the Talmud, the story of Adam begins not with his perfection, but with his imperfection. Before the breath of life was bestowed, Adam was a lifeless form, molded from the dust of the earth. A golem. The sages described this moment with awe and humility, their words imbued with reverence for the Creator who had shaped this clay into something capable of carrying a soul. The golem was a reflection of humanity's beginning, a reminder that life itself is both fragile and miraculous. Rabbi Rava, a figure whose wisdom still resonates, spoke of creation in a way that sent chills through the air of the study halls. He wrote of how he, too, had attempted to fashion life from clay, shaping a figure and uttering words of sacred power. The creature rose, not as a man but as a shadow of one, a form without the spark of the divine. Rava, realizing the gravity of his actions, unmade what he had created, leaving behind only silence and the echo of what might have been. His story, brief and enigmatic, remains a testament to the line between reverence and hubris. The Talmud does not linger on the golem, but its presence is undeniable, its implications vast. It exists in fragments, in hints, as though the sages themselves were cautious in their writings, knowing the power of the ideas they carried. They spoke of the golem with both curiosity and restraint, their words like footprints in the sand, leading toward a truth too profound to fully grasp. The texts offered no definitive answers, only questions that hung in the air like an unfinished melody. As the scholar read, he felt the weight of these questions pressing against his chest. The golem was not just a figure of clay, it was a symbol, a mirror held up to humanity's longing and fear. What does it mean to create? What does it mean to be incomplete? The Talmud whispered of these mysteries, its passages like threads weaving through the fabric of human understanding. The word golem also appeared in the Psalms, where it described something formless, a substance yet to find its shape. It was a word that evoked the quiet before the storm, the stillness before the first breath. To the psalmist, this unformed essence was sacred, a reminder of God's hand in every stage of creation. The golem was not a failure, it was a promise, a step in the process of becoming. Through the dim light of the study, the scholar's mind wandered to the stories he had heard as a child, tales of great rabbis and their encounters with the unformed. He thought of the Golem of Prague, of legends whispered with wide-eyed wonder. But here, in the Talmud, the golem was quieter, subtler, its presence more like a shadow than a figure. It was less a story and more an idea, one that spoke to the heart of what it meant to be human. The sages of the Talmud did not speak lightly of creation. They understood its power and its cost. To shape a golem was not an act of magic but of devotion, an attempt to touch the edges of divine will. Yet they also knew that such acts were fraught with danger. To create without understanding, to wield power without wisdom, was to risk imbalance, chaos. The golem was a reminder of this balance, of the need for humility in the face of the infinite. The scholar's hands trembled as he closed the scroll, the word golem lingering in his mind like a spark in the darkness. It was more than a word. It was a question, an invitation to reflect on the mysteries of existence. What does it mean to shape, to mold, to create? What does it mean to be shaped, to be molded, to be created? The Talmud did not provide answers. But it did provide a path, one that wound through the shadows of history and into the light of understanding. And in those shadows, the golem stood, silent and eternal, a witness to the endless dance between the creator and the created. The old city of Prague lay wrapped in a shroud of restless silence, the air heavy with anticipation. The narrow cobblestone streets seemed alive, whispering stories that the wind carried past the towering spires of the synagogues and over the Vltava River. Somewhere in the heart of this ancient place, the shadows stirred with a secret. A man walked these streets, a scholar and a rabbi, his steps deliberate and his heart burdened. Rabbi Judah Low, known to the people as the Maharal of Prague, was more than a leader, he was their shield against the dark forces that loomed over their lives. The city had not been kind to its Jewish residents. Fear and hatred had taken root, manifesting in rumors, blood libels, and acts of cruelty that left families trembling behind locked doors. Whispers of an accusation brewed once more, threatening to spill over into violence. Desperation clung to the community like a second skin, and eyes turned to Rabbi Low, hoping he could find a way to protect them when no one else would. Rabbi Low, with his deep-set eyes and flowing beard, bore the weight of his people's hopes like a mantle. He spent his days and nights poring over sacred texts, seeking answers in the mysteries of creation itself. Somewhere, he believed, within the ancient words lay the key to defending his people, a key that would bridge the earthly and the divine. One moonlit night, when the city was cloaked in silver and silence, Rabbi Low ascended to his attic study, his heart beating like a drum. He lit a single candle, its flame flickering as though it too felt the gravity of his thoughts. His hand hovered over a sacred text, trembling as he whispered words of prayer. He knew the risk of what he was about to do. To call upon such forces was to tread on holy ground, to walk a line between faith and transgression. But his people's survival was at stake, and desperation is a powerful fuel. The story of Adam, formed from the dust of the earth, weighed heavily on his mind. Could the Creator's breath of life, the divine spark, be imitated, even in the faintest form? His fingers brushed over a passage in the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. The words burned in his mind, ancient and potent, describing the mystical act of shaping life. It was not just knowledge, it was power, a power Rabbi Low would wield with trembling hands. With the help of his closest disciples, he descended to the banks of the Vltava River. Under the cover of darkness, they gathered clay from the riverbed, each handful heavier with meaning than its weight. The three men worked in solemn silence, shaping the clay into a hulking form, human-like but not human. As they molded its limbs and features, Rabbi Low's voice wove through the still night, chanting the sacred names of God, each syllable vibrating in the air as though the heavens themselves were listening. When the figure was complete, the three men stepped back, their breaths shallow and uneven. It was massive, its chest broad, its limbs thick with the strength of stone. Rabbi Low approached, his voice steady even as his heart raced. On the clay forehead, he inscribed the Hebrew word emet, meaning truth. It was the seal, the final act that would awaken the lifeless form. The ground beneath them seemed to shudder as Rabbi Lo spoke the final words. The figure's chest rose, then fell, as though the air itself had entered its being. Its eyes opened, dark, empty, yet alive. The Golem of Prague had been born. The first time the Golem stood, it towered over the men who had created it, its presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Rabbi Lo stepped forward, unafraid, and issued his command, "Protect." The Golem did not speak, but it understood. Its purpose was clear, its existence bound to the will of its creator. Word spread quietly through the Jewish quarter. The Golem, the silent guardian, began its watch. By day, it moved among the people, carrying out tasks, its massive frame both a comfort and a warning. By night, it patrolled the streets, its shadow a deterrent to those who sought to bring harm. The community felt a glimmer of safety for the first time in years, their faith in Rabbi Lo and in God's protection renewed. But power, even when born of necessity, carries its own weight. The Golem was a creature of clay, unfeeling, bound only to its purpose. It was tireless, relentless, and utterly obedient. Rabbi Lo knew that such power could not be left unchecked. Every time he looked into its empty eyes, he felt the enormity of what he had done. Creation, even of the most sacred kind, comes with consequences. The Golem did its work well, thwarting attempts to harm the Jewish community and disarming threats before they could grow. Yet with each act of protection, its presence grew more imposing, its strength more pronounced. Rabbi Lo began to sense that the balance was tipping, that the Golem was more than what he had intended. It was not malicious, but its power was raw and untamed, a force that could easily spiral beyond control. As the nights wore on, the rabbi found himself returning to the texts that had guided him, seeking wisdom and clarity. His prayers became longer, his voice softer, as though he was speaking directly to God. He carried the weight of his actions, not with regret, but with the humility of one who has touched the edges of the divine and returned with a trembling heart. The Golem stood as a testament to both the strength and fragility of faith. It was a protector, a savior, but also a reminder of the thin line between creation and destruction. Rabbi Lo, the Maharal of Prague, had called it forth not out of ambition but out of love, for his people, for their survival, and for the covenant they shared with the Creator. In its silent watchfulness, the Golem carried the burden of that love, its massive form a shadow over the streets of Prague, a shadow that held both hope and fear. The air within the ghetto walls was stifling, not just from the narrow, crowded streets, but from the weight of the world pressing down on the people who called this place home. It wasn't just a physical space, but a cage forged by fear and hatred, one that seemed to tighten with every passing year. The whispers of distant riots, accusations, and threats seeped through the cracks in the walls, reminding the Jewish families that safety was a fragile illusion. A father knelt by the flickering light of a candle, his trembling hands guiding his son's tiny fingers across the letters of the Torah. His voice, soft yet firm, carried the weight of centuries, teaching not just words but the strength to endure. Outside, the murmur of the night was broken by distant shouts, a reminder that the world beyond the ghetto was anything but kind. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with unspoken questions, and the father's heart broke under their gaze. He wanted to promise safety, a future free of fear, but promises are fragile when the world is unyielding. In medieval Europe, the ghettos were not homes, but fortresses of survival. Every brick seemed to hold a story of persecution, every door a shield against the unknown. The people within didn't just live, they endured. The ghettos were a response to the ever-present threat of blood libels, forced conversions, and massacres, events that were as unpredictable as the weather, but far more devastating. It was in this crucible of despair that myths began to take shape, myths that were more than stories, they were shields, born of necessity and faith. Among the flickering shadows of these ghettos, the idea of protectors took root. How could one fight against an enemy that outnumbered you, an enemy that saw you as less than human? Words were not enough, nor were prayers, though both were offered in abundance. The people needed something tangible, something that could stand between them and the ever-encroaching tide of violence. And so, the Golem began to rise, not just as a figure of clay, but as a force of hope. The ghettos were filled with whispers, not just of fear but of resilience. Stories passed from lips to eager ears, stories of beings formed from the earth itself, imbued with the power of the divine. These protectors were imagined to be tireless, strong, and unyielding, everything the people themselves could not be. In their minds, the golem was not just a savior but a reflection of their deepest longings, to stand tall, to fight back, to be more than mere victims. The myths didn't emerge from idle imagination but from a history steeped in suffering. The ghettos bore witness to horrors that etched themselves into the collective memory. Families ripped apart, children lost, synagogues burned, all because they refused to abandon their faith. These acts of persecution didn't just break them, they forged something unbreakable. From their tears and prayers came stories that refused to let them be defined by their oppressors. On cold nights, when the streets were eerily quiet, mothers would tell their children of the golem, a creature so powerful that even the cruelest of enemies would cower before it. The stories were filled with details that made them feel real. The golem didn't just protect, it understood. It bore the pain of its people, standing as a silent guardian, its very existence a reminder that they were not alone. The children would fall asleep clutching the idea of this protector, their fears momentarily eased by the thought of a savior who could not be broken. For the men and women within the ghettos, the myths were more than stories, they were acts of defiance. To believe in the golem was to believe that they could survive. It was a way to fight back against a world that sought to erase them. The golem was their voice when words failed, their strength when their own was spent. In its silent form, it carried the cries of generations, standing tall in a world that sought to keep them small. The creation of these myths wasn't just an escape but a way of reclaiming power. The golem was formed from clay, the very earth that the Jewish people were so often denied. It was a reminder that even from the most humble beginnings, something mighty could arise. The act of shaping the golem in their minds mirrored the act of shaping their identity, an identity that refused to be erased no matter how much the world tried to crush it. The ghettos were places of pain, but also places of profound faith. Each brick, each narrow alley, bore witness to prayers that rose like smoke, prayers for protection, for deliverance, for strength. The golem became an answer to those prayers, a manifestation of their collective will to survive. It wasn't just a creature of clay but a testament to the unyielding spirit of a people who refused to be defeated. Even as the ghettos pressed in around them, the stories of the golem gave the people space to breathe. They found solace in the idea that somewhere, somehow, a protector could rise from their midst, one that wouldn't falter in the face of hatred. The golem became a symbol of what they could be, strong, enduring, and capable of standing against the tide. In the quiet corners of the ghettos, under the weight of oppression, the golem was born, not in the physical sense, but in the hearts and minds of a people who needed it most. It was a myth, yes, but also a lifeline. It gave them courage when courage seemed impossible, hope when hope was a fragile thing. And though the golem itself may have been silent, its presence spoke volumes. It told the world that even in the darkest of times, there is a spark that refuses to be extinguished. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world feels suspended between night and day, there's a stillness that carries a kind of sacred weight. It's in this silence, this pause, that creation itself seems closest, like the whisper of a word not yet spoken, the brush of a hand poised over unshaped clay. There is something eternal in that unformed potential, a reminder that even the simplest materials can carry the spark of the infinite. Clay. Cold, damp, and unremarkable to the touch. Yet within it lies the essence of life itself. It's the substance from which humanity was first formed, the medium through which the Creator sculpted the very first breath. The Torah describes God fashioning Adam from the dust of the earth, shaping him with care, imbuing lifeless clay with soul and purpose. That act wasn't just an origin, it was a declaration of love, of intention, of divine connection. To work with clay is to touch the origins of existence, to feel the pulse of creation under your fingertips. In Jewish thought, the act of creation is sacred beyond words. It's not just about forming something new, it's about partnering with the divine, stepping into a space where the boundaries between human and God blur for a fleeting moment. Clay holds a special place in this process, not for its strength or beauty, but for its humility. It is malleable, willing, ready to be transformed. In its simplicity lies its power. To shape clay is to acknowledge both the fragility and the resilience of life, to know that everything can be broken but also made anew. There is something profoundly human about clay. It's not pristine or polished, it's messy, raw, and unrefined. It clings to your hands, stubborn and unyielding at times, but when you persist, it begins to soften, to listen, to take on the shape of your vision. It's a reminder of the effort and patience it takes to create something meaningful. It demands care, just as life does. And as you work, you can't help but see yourself reflected in it, both the flaws and the potential. The rabbis spoke of this often, weaving the significance of clay into their teachings. They saw in it a profound metaphor for the human condition. We are, after all, beings of dust and spirit, formed from the earth yet carrying a spark of the divine. To create with clay is to mimic the Creator, to remember that we too are creators in our own right. Every time hands touch clay, it's as if they are participating in that first act of formation, echoing the moment when lifeless matter became something extraordinary. But creation is not without its struggles. Clay resists, it cracks under pressure, dries too quickly, or refuses to hold its shape. It reminds us that creation is never easy. It's a process fraught with challenges, frustrations, and imperfections. And yet, it's in those imperfections that the true beauty lies. The cracks in the clay are where the light enters, where the story of its making becomes visible. To work with clay is to embrace imperfection, to find meaning not in perfection but in persistence. The mystics understood this deeply. In their teachings, clay wasn't just a material, it was a symbol of transformation. It represented the raw potential of humanity, the idea that we are all works in progress, constantly being shaped by the hands of time, experience, and the divine. They spoke of the Creator's hands molding each of us with care, knowing that the process was as important as the outcome. Every groove, every imperfection, was a mark of love, a sign that we are being shaped with intention. In the stories of the Golem, clay becomes more than a symbol, it becomes a vessel for life itself. It's the material chosen to bridge the gap between the human and the divine, to create something that stands at the threshold of both worlds. The act of shaping the golem is an act of faith, a reminder that even the simplest materials can carry the weight of something greater. The hands that shape the golem are not just crafting a protector, they are engaging in a sacred act, one that mirrors the creation of humanity itself. And yet, the clay also carries a warning. It is fragile, easily broken, reminding us of the delicate balance between creation and destruction. The same hands that shape can also shatter. The same material that gives life can return to dust. This tension is at the heart of the human experience, the understanding that everything we create carries both possibility and limitation. To create is to accept this duality, to embrace the risk of failure for the chance to bring something new into the world. In the quiet spaces of contemplation, clay invites reflection. It asks us to consider our own lives, our own acts of creation. Are we shaping with intention, or are we letting the pressures of the world distort our vision? Are we willing to get our hands dirty, to persist through the messiness, the mistakes, and the cracks? Clay doesn't demand perfection, it demands presence. It asks us to be fully here, to feel the weight of the moment, to embrace the process. To touch clay is to touch a piece of eternity. It connects us to the past, to the stories of those who came before us, who shaped and were shaped by the world around them. It connects us to the present, grounding us in the here and now, reminding us of our power to create. And it connects us to the future, to the hope that what we create today will carry forward, leaving its mark on the world. Clay is more than a material. It's a testament to the power of creation, the resilience of the human spirit, and the sacredness of the act of shaping something new. It is a reminder that within each of us lies the potential to create, to transform, to bring something extraordinary into existence. It is, in its simplicity, a reflection of everything that makes us human. And in its silent, unassuming way, it carries the weight of the divine. In the silent, shadowed streets of Prague, where the ghetto walls loomed high and the cobblestones carried whispers of anguish, a prayer rose like a flame. It was not a quiet plea but a fierce cry, a desperate call for protection in a world bent on destruction. The year was 1580, and danger moved like an unseen predator, coiled and ready to strike. Rabbi Judah Loew sat alone in his study, the dim candlelight tracing his withered face. He was a man of profound wisdom, a scholar whose heart ached for his people. Threats of violence hung thick in the air, rumors spreading of false accusations that could ignite a massacre. Blood libels, accusations as old as hatred itself, threatened to shatter the fragile lives of the Jewish community. They were trapped within the ghetto's walls, their prayers muffled by centuries of suffering, their pleas unanswered by a world that seemed deaf to justice. Rabbi Loew could not sleep that night. His heart raced as if answering a silent call, a sense of purpose coursing through him. He rose and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened sky. His lips moved in prayer, not for himself, but for the lives he had sworn to protect. The Torah spoke of clay, of the dust from which man was formed, and in that moment, the idea seized him, a vision of hope born from the earth itself. Gathering his closest students, he shared what had come to him in the stillness of the night. They would create a protector, a being fashioned from clay, animated by sacred words, and bound to serve the will of righteousness. His students hesitated, their faces pale in the flickering light, but Rabbi Loew's voice carried a weight they could not deny. They journeyed to the banks of the Vltava River, where the mud lay thick and heavy, rich with the memory of creation. Under the cover of darkness, the rabbi and his disciples worked in silence, their hands shaping a figure from the earth. It was massive, its limbs strong and unyielding, its form both human and otherworldly. The air seemed to hum as they worked, the boundary between the mortal and the divine growing thin. When the golem was complete, Rabbi Loew stood before it, his heart pounding with the gravity of what he was about to do. He whispered sacred words, his voice trembling but resolute. He inscribed the name of God upon the creature's forehead, the letters glowing faintly as if answering an ancient call. The clay figure stirred. Its eyes opened, empty yet alive, and it rose to its feet. The students gasped, stepping back in awe and fear. The golem was no ordinary creation, it was a force of protection, a guardian born of necessity and faith. Rabbi Loew looked into its lifeless gaze and spoke its purpose, to shield the ghetto from harm, to stand against those who sought to destroy. And so, the golem began its silent vigil. By day, it stood motionless, hidden from sight, its massive frame blending into the shadows of the ghetto. But by night, it patrolled the streets, its heavy footsteps echoing like a heartbeat through the darkness. Those who dared approach the ghetto with ill intent found themselves face to face with the towering figure, its presence enough to drive terror into even the bravest of hearts. The people of the ghetto spoke of the golem in hushed tones, their fear mingled with gratitude. They believed it was a sign of divine intervention, a symbol that their prayers had been heard. Mothers held their children close, whispering stories of the protector who walked among them, unseen but ever vigilant. But the golem was not without its challenges. It was a creation of clay, bound by the limitations of its form. It obeyed Rabbi Loew's commands with unwavering loyalty, yet there were moments when its power seemed too great, its strength too overwhelming. The rabbi, wise and discerning, understood the delicate balance required to maintain control. He ensured the creature's purpose remained pure, its actions guided by the principles of justice and mercy. Yet, power has its price. The golem was not a being of free will, it was a vessel, an extension of Rabbi Loew's intentions. The weight of its existence bore heavily on the rabbi's soul, a constant reminder of the line between creation and destruction. He prayed often, seeking guidance, his heart heavy with the knowledge that what he had brought into the world could just as easily be undone. One night, as the moon cast its silver light over the ghetto, Rabbi Loew made a decision. The danger had passed, the immediate threats quelled by the golem's silent presence. The time had come to let it rest, to return it to the earth from which it had come. Gathering his students once more, the rabbi approached the golem, its massive frame standing still as stone. He spoke the sacred words in reverse, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. The letters on its forehead faded, the light dimming until it was gone. The golem collapsed, the clay crumbling to the ground, returning to the dust from which it was formed. The streets of Prague were silent once more, the ghetto left to face its future without its protector. But the memory of the golem remained, etched into the hearts of the people. It was more than a story, it was a testament to the power of faith, the resilience of a community, and the strength of a leader who dared to create hope in a time of despair. And though the golem no longer walked the streets, its presence was felt in every whispered prayer, every act of courage, and every moment of unity that bound the ghetto together. Rabbi Lowe had given his people more than a protector. He had given them a reminder that even in the darkest times, the spark of creation could light the way forward. The night was heavy with silence, a silence that carried the weight of centuries. A young boy, barely old enough to understand the world, stood by the ghetto walls, his small hands clutching the worn fabric of his mother's skirt. Her eyes, though shadowed by fear, held a quiet determination as she whispered prayers into the darkness. It was a silence not of peace, but of anticipation, a pause before the storm of injustice that seemed always to loom. In such a world, where innocence was punished and cruelty held the reins, hope often wore a fragile face. Yet, it was in these moments of despair that justice was imagined not as a distant dream but as a force that could stand and act, unyielding and unafraid. The golem was born of this hope, not merely as clay molded into form, but as an embodiment of what justice could be, silent, steadfast, and undeniable. The people whispered of its gaze, empty but unflinching, and of its hands, strong enough to break but restrained by purpose. It did not speak, for justice needs no words. It did not judge, for its role was to protect. When it walked through the streets of the ghetto, its massive form casting long shadows, there was no mistaking its purpose. Those who sought to harm the innocent felt their courage drain like water through trembling hands. Justice had a form now, and it moved among them. The golem was not just a protector, it was a symbol of divine intervention, a reminder that the cries of the oppressed did not fall on deaf ears. Its creation was an act of defiance against a world that had turned its back on fairness, an answer to the unspoken question that lingered in the hearts of the powerless: who will stand for us when no one else will? In the stories passed down through generations, there was one night that stood out. A group of men, fueled by hatred and lies, had gathered at the edge of the ghetto, torches in hand. Their shouts pierced the air, promising destruction, their anger a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. And then it came. The golem emerged from the shadows, its towering figure bathed in the flickering light of the torches. The men froze, their bravado crumbling beneath the weight of its presence. It did not move quickly, nor did it raise its hand in anger. It simply stood there, an impenetrable wall between injustice and the innocent lives it sought to protect. One by one, the men dropped their torches, their steps retreating as fear took hold. Justice had no need to strike, its mere presence was enough to turn hatred into ash. The people of the ghetto watched from their windows, their breaths held as if afraid to disturb the fragile moment of triumph. For the first time in years, they felt a sliver of safety, a glimmer of hope. The golem was not human, and yet it carried a humanity that surpassed the men who had sought to bring harm. It did not act out of vengeance or anger, it acted out of necessity, a force that existed because the world had failed to uphold the very principles it claimed to value. There was a lesson in its silence, in the unyielding way it stood against oppression. Justice is not loud, it does not demand attention or seek applause. It simply is. Like the golem, it exists to balance the scales, to remind the world that even in its darkest moments, there is a force that will rise to meet the challenge. And yet, the golem was not infallible. It was a creation, a vessel shaped by human hands and divine intention. It carried the weight of its purpose with a quiet dignity, but it was also bound by the limitations of its creators. Rabbi Lowe understood this better than anyone. He had given life to the golem not as a permanent solution, but as a reminder, a beacon for what justice should strive to be. In its very being, the golem reflected the paradox of justice. It was both powerful and fragile, a force that could shield the innocent, but also one that required care and balance. Rabbi Lo often prayed over the golem, not for its strength, but for the wisdom to guide it, the humility to wield its power without corruption. The stories say that the golem eventually returned to the earth, its purpose fulfilled, its form crumbling back into the clay from which it had been born. But its legacy remained, etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed its quiet strength. The ghetto walls may have stood tall, but for a time, justice had stood taller. The golem was more than a protector, it was a mirror held up to the world, reflecting both its failures and its possibilities. It was a reminder that justice is not an abstract concept, but a force that must be embodied, even if only for a moment. The people of the ghetto carried its memory with them, whispering its name in times of fear and hope. They knew that the golem was not just a story, but a promise, a testament to the power of faith, the resilience of the oppressed, and the unshakable truth that justice, though it may be silent, is never absent. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls of a crowded room. A rabbi's voice carried through the still air, weaving a story that felt older than the earth itself. Children sat cross-legged at his feet, their eyes wide with wonder, while elders leaned in, their faces marked by years of toil and resilience. In his words, the golem lived again, its story shifting and transforming, reflecting the hopes and fears of each listener. In Spain, the golem was said to have been born in the time of expulsions, when Jewish communities were driven from their homes, their lives uprooted by cruelty. This golem was not a towering figure of strength, but a quiet guardian, one who walked unseen alongside those who fled, guiding them through the dark forests and barren deserts. They whispered that it left no footprints, that its presence was felt only in the safety it brought. Mothers clung to their children, their hearts pounding as soldiers' voices echoed in the distance. But the soldiers never came closer, their steps faltering as if an invisible wall had risen between them and their prey. In these tales, the golem was less a warrior and more a protector of those who had no choice but to run. It was a symbol of survival, a silent reminder that even when the world turned against them, they were not truly alone. In Germany, the golem's story grew darker, its edges sharp with the pain of blood libels and false accusations. Here, the golem was a force of reckoning, its strength called upon to shield communities from the violence of baseless hatred. It was said that the golem would appear when the cries of the innocent reached heaven itself, rising from the earth with eyes that burned like fire. There was a night, the elders whispered, when a mob gathered outside a synagogue, torches blazing like a sea of flames. Inside, the people huddled together, their prayers a desperate plea. The golem came then, its form vast and unyielding. It moved through the crowd with deliberate steps, its presence an unspoken command to stop. The torches fell from trembling hands, and the mob dispersed, their anger swallowed by fear. But the golem's strength was not without cost. In these stories, it was said that each time the golem acted, it grew heavier, its movements slower, as if the weight of the injustice it confronted became its burden to bear. And when its task was done, it would return to the earth, leaving behind only the memory of its power and the hope it inspired. In Poland, the golem took on a different form, its story steeped in both tragedy and triumph. This golem was crafted not to defend, but to create, a being whose hands were said to shape the world around it. In times of famine, it would till the fields, its strength endless, its touch gentle enough to coax life from the barren soil. In times of despair, it would carve out shelters from the rock, offering refuge to those who had none. Yet, the golem in these tales was not invincible. It was said that its creators loved it too much, treating it not as a tool but as a child, a being to be cherished. They gave it tasks beyond its understanding, and in its innocence, it sometimes made mistakes. A field meant to be cleared would be left in ruins, a shelter meant to protect would crumble beneath the weight of its own stone. The people forgave the golem its errors, seeing in it their own struggle to navigate a world that often seemed impossible to understand. They loved it not for its perfection but for its intention, for the way it tried, again and again, to bring something good into existence. Across these communities, the golem's story shifted and grew, shaped by the lives of those who told it. It was a protector, a guide, a worker, and a child. Its clay body bore the imprint of 1,000 hands, each shaping it into a reflection of their deepest hopes and fears. In Spain, its quiet footsteps spoke of escape and survival. In Germany, its burning gaze was a shield against hatred. In Poland, its strong yet clumsy hands built a world that echoed the resilience of those who lived within it. Each story was different, yet they all carried the same truth: the golem was more than clay. It was the will to endure, the courage to stand, and the belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice and compassion could still take shape. The rabbi's voice faltered, his words trailing off as the candle burned low. The children shifted, their faces alight with questions, while the elders sat in silence, their eyes filled with memories. The golem was gone, but its story remained, alive in the hearts of those who would carry it forward. In every whispered tale, and every prayer for protection, the golem would rise again, its form changing with each telling but its essence always the same. A reminder that hope and justice could be shaped from the simplest of materials, even from clay. The air was thick with anticipation, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the small, hidden room. On the table, scattered pages of ancient texts lay like forgotten dreams, their inked words trembling with unspoken power. In the stillness of the night, a whisper echoed, the sound of words from a language older than memory. The rabbi's hands trembled as he traced the letters, his lips moving in quiet prayer. With each word, he could feel something shifting in the room, something unseen but undeniable. The golem, an ancient being made of clay, was no mere creation of hands. In Kabbalistic rituals, it was believed that the true power to animate it didn't come from the physical molding, but from the sacred texts, the hidden words that carried the weight of divine energy. The Zohar, the mystical text of Jewish Kabbalah, spoke of letters as vessels of creation, holding the very essence of the divine. It was these letters, whispered with intent, that breathed life into the clay, awakening it from its lifeless form. Each time the rabbi muttered the sacred words, he wasn't just speaking to the golem. He was speaking to the universe itself, calling upon the divine forces that governed existence. The letters were not mere symbols, but powerful forces capable of creating and destroying with a single utterance. They connected the earthly realm to the heavens, a bridge that could span the unimaginable distance between the human soul and the Creator. As the rabbi's voice grew louder, the room seemed to pulse with energy. The golem, lifeless and still, began to tremble. Its clay body, so heavy and dense, seemed to hum with a strange power, as though the very earth was urging it to rise. And then, in the deepest silence, it began. A slow, grinding movement, as if the earth itself was awakening. The clay began to shift, its body slowly taking shape, its eyes, empty at first, beginning to flicker with something that could only be called awareness. The ritual was not only about words, it was about intention. The rabbi's mind, sharpened by years of study, was in sync with the divine will. He was not the one controlling the golem, but merely the vessel through which divine intervention occurred. The ancient texts spoke of the power of the Hebrew letters, of their ability to channel the infinite energy of the divine. To speak them with the right intent, to form the right combinations, was to open a door that could never be closed. The golem's form grew more defined, its features rough and unfinished, a reflection of the world's brokenness. It had no soul of its own, no capacity for true thought or emotion. But it had power, great power, harnessed through the sacred words. It was an instrument, created not to serve a master, but to fulfill a divine purpose. But with power came responsibility. The rabbi knew that the golem's animation was a delicate balance. If the sacred words were spoken in haste, if the intention wavered, the golem would falter. It was like trying to hold a storm in your hands, unstable, dangerous, and wild. There were whispers among the Kabbalists, warnings of the golem's potential to slip beyond control, to turn from protector to destroyer. As the golem stood, its massive form looming over the rabbi, there was a strange, unsettling silence. The room, once filled with the crackling of the fire, was now still. The air felt thick, as though the very fabric of reality had shifted. The golem's eyes glowed faintly, not with the warmth of life, but with the cold, unwavering light of a creature bound to the will of the divine words. Yet, there was more to the golem than just its physical strength. It was not just a brute, a mindless servant. The rituals carried with them a deeper significance, a sense of divine justice, of balance between good and evil. The golem was meant to be a protector, but it was also a reminder that divine power was not meant to be wielded recklessly. Each ritual, each word spoken, was a covenant with the divine, a contract that bound the rabbi to a greater purpose. In those moments, as the golem stood before him, the rabbi understood the gravity of what he had done. The golem was not just a tool, it was an expression of the divine will, a reflection of the Creator's power made manifest. To use it carelessly was to risk unraveling the very fabric of reality. The sacred texts were not just instructions, they were a map to navigate the unknown. They were the foundation of the golem's existence, the very breath that gave it form. The rabbi's role was not to command the golem, but to serve as a conduit for a higher purpose. To summon the golem was to summon the divine, to call upon forces that could never be fully understood. It was a reminder that human power was always limited, that no one, not even the rabbi, could control the vastness of creation. As the ritual ended and the golem returned to its dormant state, the rabbi was left with a quiet, uneasy feeling. The power of the sacred texts, of the letters and words, was undeniable. But it came with a price. The very act of animating the golem had created a rift in the world, a shift that could never be undone. The golem, though still, was never truly gone. It lay dormant, waiting for the day when the words would once again bring it to life. And so, in the quiet of the room, the rabbi sat, his hands trembling slightly. The golem had been created, animated by the divine will, but he knew that such power was not without consequences. He understood, as he had always understood, that the words were not just tools, they were a bridge to something greater, something far beyond the human realm. And though the golem stood as a protector, it was also a reminder, the sacred words, once spoken, could never be unspoken. They would echo through eternity, shaping the world in ways no one could ever fully comprehend. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the room where the rabbi stood, his hands trembling. Before him lay the golem, its clay form solid and unmoving, but in the air lingered an energy, thin, fragile, yet so potent it could shatter the world. The rabbi closed his eyes, drawing in a slow, steady breath, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. He reached for the sacred parchment, his fingers brushing against the letters inscribed on it. These letters weren't mere symbols, no, they were vessels, each one a thread connecting the human soul to the divine. The Hebrew alphabet. It was more than just a tool for communication, it was the language of creation itself. Each letter held within it the power to shape reality, to mold the very essence of the world. The rabbi whispered the words, his voice soft but firm, and in that moment, he was not simply speaking. He was wielding the fabric of existence, summoning the divine power that could bring life to the lifeless, animate the inanimate. The letters formed on his lips, one by one, and as each sound escaped, the golem stirred. Its body, once inert, seemed to come alive with every word. The letters were alive in their own right, vibrating with energy, rippling through the space between worlds. Each one carried its own vibration, its own resonance, and together, they held the key to everything. Emet, the rabbi whispered, his voice barely a breath. The first letters of truth, the beginning of life itself. The golem's eyes flickered, then widened, as if it were beginning to understand something far beyond the reach of its clay body. The Hebrew alphabet was not just a tool for creation, it was the very essence of creation. Every letter was infused with divine power, each stroke carrying the potential to shape worlds. The letters of the Torah, in their sacred order, held the power to birth life, and when spoken correctly, they could give life to the lifeless, as the rabbi had done with the golem. They were a channel, a conduit for the divine force that shaped the cosmos. But with power came responsibility. The rabbi knew that the words he spoke were not simply for creation, they could also be for destruction. The same letters that could breathe life into the golem could just as easily unmake it. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the choice before him. If the golem was to be controlled, if it was to serve its purpose, the rabbi had to keep the letters in balance. One wrong move, one misstep, and the very force that had given the golem its life could turn against him. Emmett, the rabbi whispered again, the word strong and steady, holding the golem in place. But there was another word, a word that could undo it all. The rabbi reached for it, feeling its weight pressing on his heart. The letters trembled in his mind as the word formed, met. The change was subtle at first. The letter MEM, when joined with the letter TAF, transformed everything. It was the end, the destruction of all that had been built. The same letters, when rearranged, held the power to erase, to return everything to the clay it once was. The golem's eyes, once bright with the flickering light of life, began to dim. Its massive frame, which had once towered with purpose, now seemed to shrink, to cave in on itself. The energy that had once filled the room, thick and pulsing, now felt heavy, suffocating. The rabbi felt a deep ache in his chest, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew that the golem's creation was a gift, but it was also a curse. The letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the sacred words he had spoken, had brought life to this creature, but they could just as easily take it away. The power of the letters was undeniable. With each stroke, with each word, the rabbi shaped the world around him. The letters themselves were alive, charged with an energy that could not be tamed. They were divine, powerful beyond measure, and yet fragile, so fragile that even a single mistake could lead to destruction. The golem's body began to crack, the clay fissuring under the weight of the divine force that had brought it into existence. The letters, those sacred, unyielding letters, trembled as they held the golem in place. They had given it life, but now, they were taking it back. The rabbi reached for the parchment again, his hands shaking. He could feel the power in the letters as he traced them, his fingertips brushing the edges of each one. These were the same letters that had once shaped the world, that had once breathed life into the golem. They were ancient, timeless, and yet, they were still as powerful as they had ever been. He spoke the words again, softly, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter everything. Emmett. The golem's eyes flickered, its massive form trembling as the power of the sacred letters surged through it. For a moment, it seemed as though the golem might awaken again, as if the divine words might bring it back to life. But then, the room fell silent. The letters had done their work, and now, all that remained was the stillness. The rabbi stood in the silence, his breath shallow, his heart heavy. The letters, the sacred words of the Hebrew alphabet, had created the golem, but they had also brought it to an end. The power of the letters was both a blessing and a curse, capable of creation, capable of destruction. The golem, in its silence, was a testament to that power, a reminder of the weight that the letters carried. The Hebrew alphabet, each letter, each word, was more than just a tool for communication. It was the very essence of creation itself, holding within it the power to shape and unshape, to breathe life and to take it away. And as the rabbi stood, alone in the room with the golem, he understood something that could never be fully grasped. The letters, like the power they held, were both a gift and a burden. The golem had been a creation of those letters, but it had also been their destruction. And in the end, the power of those words, those sacred letters, was something that could never be fully controlled. The rabbi stood alone in the quiet of his study, the weight of the parchment heavy in his hands. The air in the room was thick with the ancient dust of sacred texts, yet the only thing that occupied his mind was the figure of the golem. It stood in the corner of his room, its clay form lifeless, yet it pulsed with a power that felt all too real. In its silence, there was an unspoken question, one that gnawed at the rabbi's heart, growing louder with every passing moment. "Have I done the right thing?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice shaking. The golem, a creature he had brought to life through ancient rituals and sacred words, had been created to protect his people. But now, as it loomed over him, its power almost suffocating, he questioned everything. The act of creation was sacred, divine even, but could it be justified? The golem was a being born from clay, infused with the very essence of life itself through the power of words. But as the rabbi looked at its stone-like eyes, he saw something more than just a protector. He saw a question, a challenge to the morality of what he had done. Who was he to play the role of God? What right did he have to breathe life into something that had no soul, no will of its own? The dilemma hung over him like a storm cloud. In his attempt to protect his people, had he made something that could one day become uncontrollable? Something that could destroy, rather than protect? The golem's very existence was a testament to his power, but was it also a reminder of the dangers of playing with forces beyond his understanding? He thought of the ancient words that had given the golem its form, words that had the power to bring life into clay, to create something that was, in essence, artificial. And yet, the golem was not truly human. It had no family, no past, no hopes or dreams. It could not laugh, could not love. It was only a reflection of the will of its creator, an extension of the rabbi's intentions. But as it stood before him, silent and imposing, he could no longer ignore the truth. The golem was not alive in the truest sense of the word, it was a tool, a weapon. He turned his gaze to the window, where the moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the city. The rabbi's thoughts swirled, much like the shadows that danced on the walls. He had created the golem to protect the Jewish ghetto from the rising threat of violence. Yet now, in the quiet of his study, he could not help but wonder, had he made a mistake? What if the golem could no longer distinguish between friend and foe? What if the very thing meant to protect them became their executioner? The question was not just theoretical, it was a real possibility. A golem was born from clay, and while it was powerful, it was also a thing of impulse, of rage. It had no judgment, no empathy. It could be driven by the fear and anger of its master, and that fear could easily spiral into destruction. The rabbi felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had seen the pain of his people, their suffering, their oppression, and in his heart, he had hoped that the golem could end it. He had believed that with this creation, he could protect his people from harm. But as he stood there, he realized that in his desire to protect them, he had crossed the line. The golem was a creature of force, not reason. And with every passing day, as its form grew more solid, the moral boundaries between creation and destruction blurred. He thought back to the first time he had whispered the sacred words, watching as the golem took form before his very eyes. At that moment, he had felt a surge of triumph, a sense of accomplishment that only the power of creation could bring. But now, that same sense of power felt hollow. What was the value of creating something if it could never experience the fullness of life? The golem was nothing more than a tool, a powerful one, yes, but a tool nonetheless. And tools could be misused, abused. His hand trembled as he reached for the parchment again. The word Emet was written in bold, ancient letters, the key to the golem's creation. It had given the golem life. But now, he wondered if there was a way to take that life away, to reverse the act of creation before it spiraled into chaos. But could he do it? Could he destroy the very thing he had worked so hard to create? Could he unmake it, knowing that the golem's death might save his people, but also leave him with the unshakable weight of having taken a life, no matter how artificial? As the rabbi stood in the dim light, the weight of responsibility crushed down on him. He thought of the old stories, the ones told in whispers about the golem that had gone mad, tearing through the streets, uncontrolled and merciless. What had happened to those rabbis, those creators? Had they too questioned their actions in the stillness of their studies? Had they been haunted by the same fears, the same doubts? The rabbi felt as though the room was closing in on him. He could no longer see the golem as a mere protector. He could no longer ignore the fear that crept in his heart. What if the creature he had made was not a savior, but a reminder of his own limitations? What if, in creating life, he had also created a monster? He looked into the golem's eyes once more. They were lifeless, yet they stared at him with an eerie calm, as if waiting for something. And in that silence, the rabbi could not help but wonder, was the golem's existence truly an act of divine will, or had he, in his desperation to protect, taken on a role that belonged to a higher power? The moral dilemma was clear, and yet it was impossibly difficult to resolve. The rabbi's creation was both a gift and a curse, an answer to his people's suffering, but also a question about his own ability to truly understand the consequences of his actions. Would he be able to control it, or would the golem, like so many things in this world, spiral out of control and become a force of destruction? The rabbi knew that he had to act, But in that moment, the true cost of creation hung in the air, a silent reminder that life was never as simple as it seemed. The streets of the ghetto were quiet, the kind of silence that weighed heavy on the soul. It was a calm that always preceded something dark, something that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. And in that silence, the golem stood tall, its hulking figure a silent sentinel in the shadows. Its eyes were blank, empty. Yet, they seemed to glow with a fire that spoke of something deep inside, something powerful, something ancient. It had been created to protect, and in that purpose, it had become something more than just a creation. It had become a symbol, a protector. But with every step it took, with every swing of its mighty arms, the question lingered, was it truly a savior, or was it something darker, something born from the very fear and anger that had driven its creation? The rabbi had always spoken of the golem as a tool for protection. A creature brought to life to defend those who were helpless, those who were vulnerable. The ghetto had been under siege from all sides, persecuted, despised. But now, as the rabbi watched the golem move, its large feet pounding the earth, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The golem was no longer just a defender. It had become an avenger. The first time the golem had been unleashed was a moment of pure desperation. The ghetto had been attacked, the innocent slaughtered in the streets. The people had screamed for help, and the rabbi, with no other choice, had whispered the sacred words, breathing life into the lifeless clay. The golem had risen, its massive form shaking off the weight of centuries. It had been an answer to a prayer for justice, for retribution. It tore through the attackers with brutal force, its hands crushing, its feet stomping. There was no mercy in its eyes, no compassion. There was only the relentless pursuit of retribution. In that moment, the rabbi had seen what he had hoped for, the golem had protected his people. But now, as the creature stood motionless, waiting for its next command, the rabbi wondered if there had been a line crossed. Was the golem's vengeance justified? Was it still acting in defense of the people, or had it become something else entirely, something born from anger, something that could no longer be controlled? The golem, though a protector, was also a reflection of the world that had created it, a world steeped in fear and suffering. The very power that gave it life also gave it a hunger for destruction. It was a force that could protect, but also a force that could ruin everything in its path. The rabbi had created the golem to protect the innocent, but what if the golem began to see every threat as an enemy? What if its need for vengeance spiraled out of control, turning it from a guardian to a monster? It was a thought that gnawed at the rabbi's conscience, a fear that kept him awake at night. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, and the way the golem's shadow seemed to stretch longer, darker, with every passing day. As the golem continued its vigil, the rabbi could not ignore the truth. The creature had become a symbol of both hope and terror. It was the last line of defense for the helpless, but it was also a reminder of the fragile balance between justice and destruction. The golem's heart beat with the rhythm of the world it had been created in, a world of pain, of suffering, of injustice. It had been born from that pain, and it carried it with every step it took. The golem was not a simple protector, it was a force of nature, a reminder of what could happen when anger and fear were allowed to take shape. The golem's purpose had always been to protect. But as it stood there, motionless, the rabbi realized that protection could sometimes take a darker form. The golem was not just a shield, it was a sword. It could strike down enemies, but it could also turn on those it was meant to defend. The line between protection and vengeance had become blurred, and there was no way to turn back. The golem was both a hero and a monster, a creature of salvation and destruction. There was a point when the golem had struck down an enemy so fiercely, so mercilessly, that the rabbi had felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just the force of the golem's actions, it was the way it had looked, standing over its victim, silent, unfeeling, its expression unchanged. The rabbi had seen the power of the golem, and for the first time, he had truly understood the price of creating such a creature. It was not just a protector. It was an avenger, a force driven by something that could never be undone. The golem was both a savior and a destroyer, a reflection of the world that had created it, a world that knew both the light of justice and the dark shadow of vengeance. As the rabbi watched the golem move through the streets, a strange sense of dread washed over him. The golem had done its duty, but at what cost? Was this the price of safety, of protection? To unleash such a creature was to take on the weight of not just justice, but vengeance. And vengeance had a cost. The golem was not a creature that could be tamed or controlled forever. It was not a savior in the purest sense. It was a force, a powerful reminder that even in the face of great darkness, there was always the temptation to strike back, to become what one had once feared. The golem was a protector, yes. But it was also an avenger. And that duality, the balance between life and death, between salvation and destruction, was what made the golem's existence both necessary and terrifying. With each step, the golem's shadow stretched further, casting a long, dark figure over the city. It was a protector, yes, but it was also something more. Something darker. Something that could one day turn on its own creators. And as the rabbi looked upon the creature, standing tall against the backdrop of a city that had never been kind to his people, he could not help but wonder, had he given birth to a hero, or had he awakened a force too powerful to control? The wind howled through the narrow alleys of the ghetto as the rabbi stood before the golem. The creature loomed, its clay form heavy and still, as if waiting for something, waiting for him. The rabbi's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like the weight of the world. For years, he had carried the secret of the golem with him, the knowledge that he had created life, life that should not have been his to create. It had started as a simple act of protection, a way to defend the helpless, to give strength to the weak. But now, as he looked at the golem, a growing question gnawed at him, an unease that he could not shake. Had he, in his desperation, tried to do what only God could? Had he, in the quiet of the night, dared to take on the role of the creator? There were whispers, of course. The other scholars had spoken of it in hushed voices, their words heavy with reverence and fear. "You have brought life to that which was not meant to live," they had said, eyes wide, as though they feared the consequences of such an act. They spoke of the divine image, the idea that humans were created in the likeness of God, yet were forever separated from the Creator by a boundary too vast to cross. To create life, to animate clay, was the domain of God alone. The rabbi had broken that boundary, and now the question hung over him like a shadow: what would be the consequence of trying to imitate the divine? The rabbi's mind raced as he stared at the golem. The creation of life was a gift given by God to humanity, but it was a gift that came with limits, with boundaries that should never be crossed. The creation of the golem, however well-intentioned, had been a transgression of those divine limits. And though the golem stood as a protector, as a creature of justice, it was also a constant reminder of the moral danger that came with trying to imitate the divine. Was it possible for a human to create life without stepping into realms they were never meant to touch? Was the act of creation a sacred trust, or was it a dangerous game, one that led to the blurring of the line between man and God? The rabbi had never stopped to think about it until now. He had been focused on the immediate needs of his people, on their safety, on the protection the golem offered. But standing here, with the creature's silent gaze piercing through him, the question felt more urgent than ever. The golem, with its hulking presence, seemed to mock the very notion of human limitations. It stood as proof of humanity's ability to create, to shape life from the earth, to breathe spirit into dust. Yet, as the rabbi gazed upon the golem, he could not shake the feeling that this creation was somehow wrong. There was no soul in the golem's eyes, no spark of true divinity. It was a puppet, animated by human hands, yet devoid of the deeper essence that only the Creator could impart. For the first time, the rabbi realized the magnitude of what he had done. The golem was not a creation of God. It was a creation of desperation, a creature forged from clay, animated not by the divine spark of life, but by the cold words of a man. The golem was a reflection of humanity's desire to control, to wield the power of the divine, and that was what made it both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The rabbi had known the stories, the debates about the divine image. According to the scriptures, humans were created in the image of God, but that image was not one of absolute power. It was an image of vulnerability, of the ability to choose, of the ability to love and to forgive. The golem, however, was a creature of control, a creature that obeyed without question. It had no will of its own. It did not choose, it did not love, it only acted. In that way, it was far from the image of the divine. It was an imitation, a shadow of the true creation, a perversion of what it meant to be human. As the wind howled louder, the rabbi could hear the faint murmurs of the scholars, their voices once again rising in his mind. You cannot play God, they had warned. To create life is to step into a realm where only God has dominion. He had not listened then. Now, in the stillness of the night, as the golem stood before him, he felt the weight of their words more than ever. What had the rabbi truly created? A protector? A monster? Or had he created something far more dangerous, a reminder that humanity, in its deepest desires, could never truly imitate the divine? The golem was a creature that could protect, yes. It could serve as a shield for the helpless. But it could never be more than that. It was a hollow imitation, a creation that, though it looked like life, was not truly alive. The rabbi stood still, his mind whirling, as the golem remained motionless, its lifeless eyes staring ahead. The creature was powerful, capable of great things. But it was not a creation of love. It was a creation of power. And that was the danger. For all its might, the golem could never know what it meant to be human. It could never feel the weight of the world on its shoulders, the burden of compassion, the tenderness of love. It could only act, only destroy or protect as it was commanded. It was a mirror, a reflection of the human desire to control, to shape the world in our image. But in doing so, it lost something, the divine spark that made life more than mere obedience, more than mere power. The rabbi stepped closer to the golem, his heart heavy with the knowledge that no matter how much he tried, no matter how much he wanted to protect his people, the act of creating life, true life, was not his to command. It was a gift, one that belonged to the Creator alone. And in trying to imitate that power, he had created something that would never truly be what it was meant to be. The golem stood there, a silent sentinel, guarding the streets. But it was not alive. It was not human. It was a reminder that no matter how much we try, we can never fully imitate the divine. We can never fully understand what it means to create life, to breathe spirit into dust. And that, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy of all. The night was thick with silence, the kind that felt heavy in the air, like a warning that no one could hear. In the heart of the city, the golem stood tall, a towering figure of clay, its eyes void of any warmth, its movements mechanical and cold. The streets were empty, save for the echo of footsteps that dared not approach. There was an unspoken fear that lingered in the shadows, fear of what the golem had become. Not a protector, not a savior, but something darker. A creature born of human ambition, out of a need to control and protect, but one that now existed outside of human understanding. It wasn't meant to be. And yet, there it was. The golem, alive, in a way, reminded those who saw it of the price of ambition. It was a stark lesson in hubris, a creation born of good intentions, but shaped by a human desire for power, for control, for more than what was rightfully theirs. The golem was a warning, a constant reminder that ambition could blind even the wisest. It wasn't always this way. Once, the golem had been a tool, a means of protection, forged from the earth itself by those who sought to shield their people from harm. They had thought they could master the powers of creation, that by combining ancient words and rituals, they could bring life where there was none. But in doing so, they had crossed a line that should never have been touched. The golem wasn't a guardian, it was a mirror to human folly, a creature that had no soul, no true will of its own, only the blind obedience of its maker's desires. At first, it had worked too well. The golem did as it was told, stopping those who sought to harm the helpless. It was unstoppable, a force of nature, its strength unmatched. But the very thing that made it powerful was also the thing that would doom it. For it had no heart. It had no true understanding of right and wrong. It was an instrument of power, and power alone. And power, when misused, always comes at a cost. There was a time when the Golem's creators watched from their windows, filled with pride at the creature they had made. They had done what no one else could. They had taken clay, the most basic material, and through sacred rituals, had breathed life into it. It was a miracle. But miracles have a way of turning into monsters when they are not treated with respect. The creators thought they could control the Golem forever, that they could reign in its strength, its power. But the Golem was not made to obey forever. It was a creation that grew, in its own way, more than its makers could handle. What started as a guardian became a force of destruction. It was as though the Golem had developed a life of its own, no longer simply following commands, but interpreting them in its own cold, calculated way. It destroyed those who it was told to protect, as if to prove that power, unchecked, always destroys. The people who once hailed the Golem as their savior now saw it as a monster. And those who had made it were left to reckon with the consequences of their own pride, their own belief that they could play God. The Golem had become their greatest mistake. The lesson was clear: human ambition, when unchecked, is dangerous. The very thing that was meant to protect had now become a symbol of the cost of reaching too far, of trying to control what was never meant to be controlled. The Golem was a reminder that some powers were beyond human grasp, that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. But the creators had not seen it coming. They were too focused on the results of their work to notice the subtle signs of disaster. They had believed they could make the Golem obey forever. They had thought they could control it, that their wisdom, their knowledge, would be enough. But wisdom is not a safeguard against arrogance. The more they tried to master the Golem, the more they pushed it into something it was never meant to be. And in the end, they were left with nothing but ruin. There are those who say that the Golem was a failure because it lacked a soul. But perhaps it was a failure because it was too much like its creators, blind in its pursuit of power, incapable of seeing the danger in its own ambition. For all its strength, the Golem could not understand the very thing that made humans human, humility. And that is where the creators had faltered. They had wanted to make something that would serve them, something they could control. But in doing so, they had lost sight of the one thing that kept them human, their limitations. The Golem, like all creations born from human ambition, had been shaped by desire. And desire, when unchecked, becomes an obsession. The people who had called the Golem into being had learned this lesson too late. The Golem, no longer an obedient servant, became their undoing, and in the end, it was a reminder of the danger of thinking oneself above the limits of the world. There is a quiet, undeniable fear that creeps in when we are faced with the consequences of our own ambition. It's the fear that we may have gone too far, that we may have overreached, that we may have done something that cannot be undone. The Golem is that fear made real. It is a reflection of the darkest side of humanity, the belief that we can control forces beyond our understanding, that we can shape the world to our will. But the Golem shows us what happens when that belief turns into arrogance. It shows us that, in the end, we cannot control everything. As the Golem loomed in the darkness, its creators watched helplessly. What had once been a powerful tool of protection had become a living nightmare. And in the silence, they understood, this was not a creation that had gone wrong. This was a creation born from pride, from the belief that they could master the elements of life. And now, they were paying the price for that belief. The Golem was more than just a warning, it was a monument to the consequences of ambition. It stood as a testament to the human need for control, but also to the limits of that control. And as it towered over the city, there was no escape from the lesson it imparted. Hubris is a dangerous thing, and once the line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a wild animal, as the workshop flickered in the dim light of a single candle. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The figure lay on the table, still as death, its clay body cold and lifeless. The creator, trembling with anticipation, repeated the ancient words in a low murmur, the syllables wrapping around him like a spell. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew what he was about to do. He knew the risk. But the temptation, the overwhelming desire to control life itself, had consumed him. With the final utterance, the golem's eyes snapped open. It was the beginning of something that could never be undone. The golem, like Frankenstein's monster, was the result of an ambition that reached too far, an attempt to bring life where there was none. And in both cases, something went terribly wrong. The creators of both these beings, one made of flesh and the other of clay, were driven by an insatiable thirst for power and knowledge, but neither was prepared for the consequences of their actions. When Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's creature first opened its eyes, it was greeted by its creator's fear, not affection. Similarly, the golem, once brought to life, was not met with love, but with anxiety. Both were abandoned by those who made them, left to wander the world, unsure of their purpose. The creators had hoped for obedient servants, but instead, they had created something uncontrollable, something that mirrored their own darkest desires and flaws. The golem was meant to be a protector, a guardian. But, like Frankenstein's monster, it was alone in the world, rejected by its creator and forced to navigate its existence without guidance. Both creatures were born from the same desperate urge, to overcome the limits of humanity, to control life itself. And both faced the same tragic fate, an existence of alienation and rejection. As the golem moved through the streets, it was a silent reminder of human hubris. Its creator, a rabbi who had used sacred words to bring it to life, was horrified by what he had done. What was supposed to be a protector had become an unstoppable force, one that could not be reasoned with, one that was beyond the control of its maker. It was a reflection of the creator's own flaws, the belief that he could wield power over life, that he could play God without facing the consequences. Frankenstein's monster, too, was a reflection of its creator's own failings. Dr. Victor Frankenstein had created life, but in doing so, he had neglected to consider the moral implications of his actions. He had been blinded by his own ambition, obsessed with the idea of creating life, and had failed to understand the responsibilities that came with it. The result was a creature that was abandoned, alone, and filled with rage. The monster, like the golem, was not inherently evil, it was simply misunderstood. It was a creature of pain, a creature that had been given life, but was denied love and understanding. The similarities between the golem and Frankenstein's monster are haunting. Both creatures were created to fulfill a need, one for protection, the other for the pursuit of knowledge. But both were abandoned, left to face the world without guidance or compassion. Both were created out of a desire to transcend human limitations, but in doing so, their creators had ignored the consequences of overreaching. The very thing that had given them life had also condemned them to an existence of suffering. The golem's strength, like the monster's, was its curse. It could not be controlled, it could not be reasoned with. It was a symbol of unchecked ambition, a reflection of the creator's inability to understand the limits of their own power. The golem, like Frankenstein's creature, was a warning, an embodiment of the dangers of playing with forces beyond one's comprehension. But what makes the golem's story even more tragic is the fact that it was created with good intentions. It was meant to protect, to defend, to serve a greater good. And yet, just like Frankenstein's monster, it became a tool of destruction. Both creatures were born of a desire to help, but their creator's inability to foresee the consequences of their actions led to their undoing. The golem's creators had hoped to protect their people, but in doing so, they had created something that could not be controlled. Similarly, Frankenstein's monster had been created with the hope of advancing science, but it had been abandoned and left to suffer. The golem and Frankenstein's monster share a common fate. They were both abandoned by those who created them. In the end, both creatures were driven by a deep sense of loneliness and confusion, desperate to understand their place in the world. The golem, like the monster, had no choice but to resort to violence to protect itself from a world that rejected it. It was not evil by nature, but it had been pushed to that point by the fear and hatred of those who could not see past its form. The emotional core of both stories lies in the creator's failure to take responsibility for what they had made. Both the golem and Frankenstein's creature were cast aside, left to face the world without love, without guidance, and without understanding. They were abandoned by the very people who had given them life. In the end, both the Golem and Frankenstein's monster became symbols of the dangers of overreaching ambition, reminders of the consequences of attempting to control life in a way that was never meant to be. And yet, the pain of the Golem, like the pain of Frankenstein's monster, speaks to something deeper, something universal. It speaks to the loneliness that comes with being misunderstood, the desperation that comes from being created for a purpose, but finding that purpose stripped away. Both creatures, in their own way, remind us of the cost of ambition, of the weight of creation, and of the responsibility that comes with it. They remind us that life, in all its forms, is sacred, and that to attempt to control it without understanding it is to risk losing everything. In the quiet of the night, a small village sits at the edge of the forest, its streets lit only by the flicker of lanterns. Inside a modest cottage, an old woman bends over a pile of clay, her hands trembling with the weight of an ancient task. She murmurs words, soft, flowing words, passed down through generations. With each syllable, she shapes the earth beneath her fingers, molding the clay into something more, something alive. A golem. But not like the ones you've heard of. This one is different. She is not a creation of men, a tool of power or defense. She is born of necessity, of love and longing, of a world that has forgotten to honor the feminine. As the golem slowly rises, it is not with the stiff, unfeeling movements of a mindless servant. No, she moves with grace, with purpose. She is not simply a protector, she is the embodiment of strength, of wisdom, of the feminine force that had been lost in the stories of the past. There is something hauntingly beautiful about the idea of a feminine golem. We are used to hearing of the golem as a towering figure of raw strength, a protector carved from the earth, often created by men, to serve their needs. But what if the golem could be something else? What if she were born of a woman's hands, imbued with the power to nurture, to protect, and to heal? The idea of a feminine golem is often buried in the forgotten myths, never fully realized, but the whispers remain, stirring in the shadows, waiting to be heard. In the ancient stories that have slipped through the cracks of history, there are hints of such a creation. Some speak of women who, in times of great peril, have shaped their own protectors from the earth. These were not the cold, lifeless golems we are familiar with, but rather beings of love, of compassion, and fierce protection. Women who were both creators and nurturers, and who understood the delicate balance of power that comes from the feminine. One such tale speaks of a mother who, upon losing her child to a cruel illness, turned to the ancient arts to bring him back. She did not summon a golem to wreak vengeance or cause destruction, but rather, to heal. She shaped the clay into the likeness of a woman, whose arms held the warmth of the sun, whose eyes sparkled with the promise of hope. She breathed life into the figure with words of love and sorrow, and the golem rose not as a warrior, but as a healer. It was said that this golem, with her gentle touch, could mend broken hearts, restore health, and offer solace to the grieving. Another story speaks of a woman, wise beyond her years, who lived in a village where the men had gone off to war, leaving the women to defend their homes. She shaped the earth into a golem, a mighty figure who stood tall and unyielding against the dangers that threatened her people. But this golem was not simply a warrior. She bore the wisdom of the women who had passed before her, the strength of the mothers and daughters who had lived in the village for centuries. When the enemy approached, it was the golem's voice, not her fists, that turned them away. She spoke words of understanding, of peace, and of the strength found in unity. The men who came to fight were disarmed, not by weapons, but by the power of compassion and wisdom embodied in the golem's words. In these forgotten myths, the feminine golem is not just a protector or an avenger. She is a symbol of creation and rebirth, of strength and gentleness intertwined. She represents the power that comes from understanding, from nurturing life and growth, rather than simply conquering or dominating. Her power does not lie in violence, but in the quiet, steady force of the earth itself. Her clay is soft, yet unbreakable, just like the hands that shaped her. She is the force of nature that cannot be denied, but she is also the tender embrace that heals wounds both physical and emotional. And yet, these stories have largely been forgotten, pushed aside in favor of the male golem, a creature of destruction, born from the hands of men who sought to control life itself. The feminine golem, however, is not interested in control. She is interested in balance. She is the embodiment of a world that understands the need for both strength and tenderness, the need for both the earth's raw power and the gentleness that comes from the nurturing hands of a mother. There is something deeply emotional about the idea of the feminine golem. In a world where power is often equated with violence and force, she represents a different kind of strength. She is the quiet power of the earth, the unspoken strength of women who have always shaped the world with their hands. The feminine golem is a reminder of the power that exists within all of us, whether we are mothers, daughters, or creators. It is a power that does not need to shout or demand attention. It is a power that simply is. In the end, the golem, whether male or female, represents a human desire to control life and death, to shape the world according to one's will. But the feminine golem, in particular, speaks to a deeper yearning. It speaks to a desire to create, not for power, but for love. To shape life with tenderness and care, to protect not with violence, but with understanding. She is the embodiment of all that is nurturing, all that is wise, and all that is powerful in the quiet strength of the feminine. Though these myths may have been forgotten, their echoes still linger, calling out from the depths of time. The feminine golem, once lost to history, is waiting to be remembered. She is the protector who will rise again, not with the rage of destruction, but with the power of creation, of healing, and of love. The first stroke of the brush, the chisel's first tap on stone, both carry the weight of something unspoken, something larger than life itself. In those moments, the golem comes to life, not as a figure made of clay, but as an idea, a story carved into the fabric of human creativity. He is a silent scream, a figure frozen in time, yet pulsing with a strange energy. From the corners of darkened alleys to the halls of grand museums, the golem has stepped out of the myth and into the world of art and literature, his presence impossible to ignore. A painting hangs in the darkened corner of a museum. The colors are bold, almost too bright, yet there's something about them that stirs unease. It's the golem in the painting. His eyes are empty, his body the hulking mass of stone and clay, but there's something terrifyingly alive in the way his form seems to ripple. The artist, who may never have seen the golem, yet understands him intimately, captures not just the figure, but the very essence of what he represents: creation, destruction, and the thin line between the two. The golem is an idea that can be felt in the brushstrokes, faint, yet searing through the canvas, as though the golem is trying to escape the confines of his painted world and step into reality. In sculptures, the golem stands even more imposing. The sharp angles of his face cut through the air, as if daring the viewer to approach. Carved out of marble or cast in bronze, the golem's form is meant to command. But what's unnerving about these sculptures is the absence of humanity in his features. There are no emotions on his face, no warmth in his eyes. He stands, frozen in time, as a testament to human ambition gone wrong. It's as though the artist captured not just his body, but his soul, and found it lacking. He's a figure that seems to exist between two worlds, created, but not truly alive, forever trapped in the space between life and death. One sculpture, more haunting than the rest, shows the golem with his hands outstretched, as if he's reaching for something just beyond his grasp. Maybe it's freedom, maybe it's understanding, or maybe it's the one thing he was never meant to have, a soul. There's a quiet desperation in this figure, a silent longing that echoes in the cold stone. And as the viewer's gaze lingers, they feel it too, a strange unease creeping in, as if the golem himself is aware of his limitations, aware of his creation, and aware of the yearning that comes with it. In those moments, the sculpture doesn't just depict a myth, it speaks to the deepest human fears, the fear of being created without purpose, of being given life without meaning. Then there are the writings. The words that bring the golem into existence, layer by layer, until he feels as real as anyone who walks the earth. In the pages of books, the golem takes shape not as clay, but as a living, breathing symbol. Each writer who takes on the golem imbues him with a piece of their own soul, and through that, the creature becomes something more than just a figure in a tale. He becomes a mirror, reflecting humanity's darkest desires and its deepest regrets. The stories speak of a man, desperate to protect his people, who creates the golem, only to find that he cannot control it. The creature, born of clay, takes on a life of its own, wreaking havoc, destroying everything it was meant to protect. And in that destruction, there is something horrifyingly human, a recognition of how little control we really have over the things we create. The golem becomes more than just a tool. He becomes a warning, a shadow of the dark corners of the human mind. In the ink of the pages, he is given form, but it is not a form of peace. It is the form of chaos, the form of a life gone terribly wrong. But even in these dark stories, there is something compelling about the golem. There's a part of us that understands him, the desire to create, the thirst for power, the drive to make something that will last. And there's also the fear of what happens when creation is taken too far, when ambition clouds judgment, when the lines between life and death are blurred. The golem in literature is not just a character, he is a question that lingers in the air, unanswered, haunting. What happens when we try to control life itself? What happens when we try to play God? And yet, despite the fear, there is a strange beauty in these depictions of the golem. The way his story unfolds, his rise from lifeless clay, his slow awakening, and his eventual fall, mirrors the very human condition. We all seek to create, to leave something behind that will endure. But what if, in our attempts to build something grand, we lose control? What if the very thing we make becomes a reflection of our deepest flaws? Through the brushstrokes of artists, the chisel of sculptors, and the words of writers, the golem lives on. His presence is impossible to ignore, for he represents something universal, the human desire to create and the consequences of that creation. Whether on a canvas, in a sculpture, or in a book, the golem serves as a reminder of the fine line between life and death, between control and chaos. In every depiction, there's a sense of inevitability, as if the golem's story will always unfold in the same way, his creation, his rise, and his tragic end. The golem stands not just as a figure, but as a testament to the power of art and literature. Through these depictions, we understand the golem in ways we might never understand in the real world. He is more than just a clay figure, he is a symbol of the human struggle, the desire to create, and the fear of what happens when creation goes too far. In the world of art, the golem is not merely an image, he is a living, breathing reflection of ourselves. The darkened room hums with suspense as the flicker of a shadow stretches across the screen, casting a figure too large to ignore. It's monstrous, looming, almost too big for its own space. This is the golem in film, standing taller than life, its stone-gray skin rippling with unnatural strength. He doesn't speak, he doesn't need to. His presence fills the room like an unspoken truth, a warning whispered through the ages. The camera lingers on his hollow eyes, and in those empty sockets, something chilling stirs, a reflection of human ambition gone awry, a force created to protect but destined to destroy. The golem is here, not just in the pages of ancient stories, but in the heart of modern media, a legend alive in the flickering images of cinema, television, and the ever-expanding universe of popular culture. In the world of film, the golem has found new life, evolving from a mythic creature of clay to a symbol of creation and catastrophe. His legacy stretches far beyond the dusty scrolls of yore, taking form in movies that grasp at the same darkness that haunted the streets of Prague centuries ago. Each cinematic version of the golem adds another layer to the tale. Some cast him as a mindless brute, others as a tragic hero, and in each, there's a piece of something ancient, something primal. He is a being of raw power, not bound by flesh or blood, yet his presence is felt as profoundly as any human heart. Every time he steps onto the screen, his story takes root in the fears and desires of the modern world, turning his fate into a mirror for our own. But the golem's journey in film is not always one of mindless destruction. In the shadows of horror movies and action-packed blockbusters, there are quieter moments, moments where his loneliness is almost unbearable. In those rare films, we see the golem not just as a creature of fear, but as one of sorrow. He is a product of human hands, yet he yearns for something more. What does it mean to be born from the earth, to be shaped from clay and commanded by human will, yet never to know the warmth of life or the beauty of true purpose? In the silence of his movements, there is a sadness that we can feel, a loneliness that resonates with our deepest emotions. The golem becomes not just a threat, but a symbol of something we all fear, the consequences of trying to create life without truly understanding it. Television, too, has embraced the golem, using him to explore the darker corners of the human psyche. Whether in gritty crime dramas, supernatural thrillers, or fantasy epics, the creature has evolved, his legend remade with every new screenwriter's pen. In these shows, the golem is no longer just a figure from a distant past, but a living, breathing part of the stories we tell ourselves. He's no longer bound by the limitations of clay or earth. He has become an idea, a figure that rises up when creation goes too far. His motives are not always clear, and his actions can be unpredictable, but in his chaos, there's a strange clarity. He embodies our attempts to control that which we cannot, and he serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that come with overreach. There's something eerily familiar in these modern depictions of the golem. The creature is no longer just an ancient myth, but a warning we continue to tell ourselves over and over again. Movies like Frankenstein echo the same themes, blending science and magic, ambition and regret. The golem shares a tragic kinship with Mary Shelley's creature, both made from human hands, both abandoned and misunderstood, both driven to violence by the very people who created them. But there is one thing the golem offers that Frankenstein's monster does not: the knowledge of what it feels like to be completely alone. The golem doesn't speak, but in the silence of his existence, we hear the unspoken cry of every creator: what if our creations don't love us back? The influence of the golem in modern media stretches even further, carving a place for him in video games, graphic novels, and other forms of popular culture. In video games, the golem is no longer just a figure to be feared. He's an obstacle, a challenge, a quest. But even here, in the digital realm, he retains his haunting qualities. With every pixelated step, he reminds us that creation is not without consequence. He is not just an enemy to be defeated, but a reflection of what happens when human ambition crosses a line that should never have been touched. His role in these games mirrors his mythic origins, an entity created to protect, only to turn on those who made him. In the push of a button, players confront the golem's rage, his sense of betrayal, his tragic path to destruction. In graphic novels, the golem finds himself reimagined yet again. His hulking form is drawn in jagged, sharp lines, his body a mass of crumbling stone and earth, yet there's something more there. His eyes are not empty in these illustrations, they are filled with a strange intensity, a depth that speaks of pain, of love lost, and of a humanity that still lingers beneath the stone. The golem in these pages is not just a monster or a protector. He is a creature caught between worlds, caught between the magic of his creation and the curse of his existence. Every comic strip, every graphic panel, pulls us deeper into that space, forcing us to confront not just the golem's anger, but our own. His fate, no matter the medium, is always the same. But the way we see him? That changes every time. And so, the golem continues to live, not just in ancient tales, but in the pulse of modern culture, rising from the shadows whenever the human story turns too dark. From the glow of the movie theater screen to the flicker of a TV, from the pages of a comic book to the controller in our hands, the golem is there, watching, waiting, teaching. He reminds us of the danger in playing God, of the horror in creation without understanding, and of the terrible cost of ambition unchecked. The golem is no longer just a tale from the past. He is a part of our collective unconscious, a figure that rises in our stories to remind us of the price of our desires. And as long as we tell stories, the golem will remain, forever part of the human condition. The cold chill of night hangs heavy in the air. A single candle flickers, casting shadows that dance against the walls, and in the flickering light, the words of an ancient ritual echo through the room. The words are not spoken aloud, but felt deep in the bones, as if the very fabric of reality trembles with their power. The golem, that monstrous creation of clay and will, does not come to life simply by the touch of a hand or the utterance of a command. There is a ritual, a spell, a secret, a way to awaken it from the stone that binds it. But that secret is hidden in the dark corners of mystic texts, in the symbols that whisper of forgotten knowledge. The first step is always silence. The world outside falls away, and the one who would breathe life into the golem begins with a simple act, the careful formation of words, written not in ink but in ancient symbols. These symbols are not just characters or letters, they are fragments of the universe itself. They are the building blocks of creation, drawn with a reverence that would make the heavens tremble. Each stroke is a prayer, each curve and line a plea to the forces that lie beyond the material world. And as the symbols are etched onto the clay, they form a connection between the earth and the divine, a bridge between what is and what could be. The mystics who wrote of the golem knew that it wasn't enough to simply carve the symbols. There had to be something more. Something intangible, something that only the chosen few could understand. It was in the silence of the ritual, the stillness before the storm, that the magic was woven. The words were not just written, they were lived. The very air seemed to hum with energy, charged with the kind of power that could break the laws of nature itself. It wasn't a simple spell, it was a pact with forces that humans could barely comprehend. And then came the name. Not just any name, but the name of God. The name that could part the seas and raise the dead. The name that no mortal tongue should dare to speak. Yet, in the ritual of the golem, it was spoken, not aloud but whispered in secret, passed from one person to another in the darkened chambers of hidden rooms. It was this name, more than any other word, that would give the golem its breath, its life. With the name, the golem was no longer just clay, it was a vessel for the divine. It was something greater than its creator, something dangerous and powerful. But even with the words and the name, the golem could not be simply called into existence. There was another secret, a step that many would overlook, but the wise knew all too well. The ritual of the golem required the alignment of the stars, the position of the moon, the movement of planets that could not be understood by ordinary men. The golem's creation had to occur at the right moment, in the right place, when the cosmos itself conspired to make it possible. There were specific hours in the day when the ritual could be performed, and it was only during these moments that the golem could be brought to life. Any mistake, any misstep, and the ritual would fail. Worse, it could turn the golem into something uncontrollable, something more dangerous than even the creator could handle. As the ritual reached its climax, the hands that formed the clay were not just hands. They were conduits for the divine energy, hands that shaped the figure not with the intention of creation but of control. The golem was not meant to have free will, it was an instrument, a servant of its master. But the ritual did not just bind the clay, it bound the creator as well. In breathing life into the golem, the mystic also breathed life into something dark within themselves. It was a connection, a bond that could not be broken without consequence. The golem would serve, yes, but the price of that service would always be paid, sometimes in the blood of those who dared to give it life. In some versions of the ritual, there is a final step that has been lost to history. The last, most secret part of the ceremony is not a word or a symbol, but a gesture. A simple gesture, but one that speaks volumes. It is said that when the creator makes this final motion, the golem's soul is sealed, bound to its creator for eternity. Without it, the golem could never truly live. It would remain as it was, a puppet, an empty shell. But with it, the golem becomes more than just a creature of clay. It becomes a force of nature, a being that cannot be ignored. And the creator? They are no longer just human. They are something else, something that walks the line between life and death, creation and destruction. There are those who say that the golem's power was never meant to be used for good. That the creation of such a being was a dangerous, arrogant act, one that would always lead to tragedy. They speak of the ancient texts that warned against tampering with the forces of life and death, that creation could not be done without consequence. The golem, they say, was never meant to be a protector, a servant. It was a mirror for the creator's own soul, a reflection of the darkness they carried within them. And as the golem grew, as it learned to move and think and act, it would inevitably turn against its creator, for the bond between them was never one of love. It was one of control. The rituals and symbols described in the mystic texts were never meant for the faint of heart. They were for those who understood that to create life, to breathe life into something from nothing, was to invite destruction. The golem was a creation born of arrogance and ambition, and the rituals that gave it form were meant to be guarded, hidden, forgotten. But they never truly disappear. They linger in the corners of old books, in the whispers of forgotten scholars, in the shadows of our darkest fears. Because the golem is not just a creature of clay, it is a lesson. A lesson about the price of creation, about the cost of power, and about the danger of seeking to control that which cannot be controlled. And as long as the rituals exist, as long as the symbols are remembered, the golem will live on, waiting for someone to make the same mistake once again. The air in the room is thick with tension, as though something is about to happen, something that will change everything. A figure, made of nothing but clay, stands motionless in the corner. It's lifeless, a mere sculpture of the earth beneath it. But then, a voice, low, steady, reverberates through the silence. It is not a voice that belongs to any ordinary human. It is a voice that seems to come from the very walls, from the heart of the room itself, where ancient power stirs. The words spoken are not just words, they are life, they are breath, they are everything. The name is spoken. And with that utterance, the golem's eyes flicker open. The power of the name is the key. The name is not just a collection of letters or syllables. It is a force, a pulse that beats through the fabric of the universe. To speak it is to awaken something deep, something old and sacred. The Shem, the name, is more than a mere utterance, it is a gateway, an act of creation. In those first few moments, when the name is spoken, it is as though the very air shifts. Time bends. The earth itself trembles, acknowledging the immense power of the words. There is a sacredness to the name, a reverence that cannot be ignored. It is not something that can be used lightly, not a tool to be wielded by just anyone. The name holds power, a deep, primordial power that reaches into the very soul. And when it is spoken over the clay figure, it breathes life into it. The golem's body stirs. The eyes, once empty and dull, begin to shine with a strange, unnatural light. It is no longer clay. It is a being, alive and waiting. But the Shem is not just a name of creation. It is also a name of destruction, a name that holds the power to unmake what has been made. The name is not merely a key to bring the golem to life, it is the lock that can undo it. The power to animate the creature is the same power that can erase it. The golem can only exist as long as the Shem remains in place, as long as the name is intact. And should the name be taken away, the creature will fall, returning once more to the clay from which it was formed. There is something chilling in the idea that one word, one sacred utterance, can decide whether something lives or dies. The name is not just a passive tool, it is a living, breathing part of the golem itself. The mystics who created the golem understood this deeply. They knew that the Shem was not to be treated lightly. It was a force, a power that carried with it both the ability to create and destroy. And as much as it could breathe life into the golem, it could just as easily silence it. The Shem is not a word that can be understood in ordinary terms. It is not like any name we give to another person or thing. It is a name that exists outside the realm of language, beyond what we understand as simple communication. The Shem is a key to the divine, a connection between the earthly and the sacred. To speak the Shem is to call upon something greater than oneself, to tap into a well of ancient power that is both awe-inspiring and terrifying. As the words leave the mystic's lips, the room seems to hold its breath. The golem stands still, as though waiting, as though listening. And then, as though it were waiting for permission, it moves. Slowly, almost hesitantly, as if it is unsure of its own existence. It is not a creature of instinct, but of purpose. It moves because it has been told to move. It walks because it has been given the gift of motion. And all of it is because of the name. But what happens when that name is taken away? When the sacred words are no longer uttered, when the Shem is lost or destroyed? The golem, once full of life, falls silent. Its movements become sluggish, its eyes dim. It becomes nothing more than clay again, a statue frozen in time. The life it once had is gone, and it returns to the earth, just as it came. But the truth is more chilling: it can never truly be erased. The golem's soul, the essence of its being, is always tethered to the Shem. It can be deactivated, but it can never truly be undone. There is a certain sadness in this, a melancholy that hangs over the golem's existence. It is both alive and dead, forever in a state of limbo, depending on the name to determine whether it is a creature of life or a monument of stone. The Shem is the pulse that keeps it alive, but it is also the weight that holds it in place. The golem is bound to its creator by the name, and the name alone. And when the name is no longer spoken, it is as though the golem's existence is suspended, waiting for a command that may never come. It is the Shem that separates the golem from mere clay. It is the name that gives it meaning, that gives it purpose. Without it, the golem is nothing. But with it, it becomes a creature of power and might. The name is everything, the one thing that gives the golem life, and the one thing that could destroy it. And as long as the Shem is kept safe, as long as the name is protected, the golem will live. But once the name is gone, so too is the golem, lost to the winds of time. The Shem is more than a name. It is the key to the golem's existence, the force that binds it to the world of the living. It is a reminder of the power that lies in words, in names, in the things we speak into existence. And in that power, there is both creation and destruction, life and death. The Shem is a delicate balance, a sacred word that holds the golem's fate in its syllables, and it is this balance that makes the golem's existence both terrifying and beautiful. The air crackles with ancient energy, the weight of the world heavy with the power of letters. In the dim light of the candlelit room, a figure stands before a table, fingers trembling slightly as they trace the outlines of symbols, symbols that have held the key to understanding the universe for thousands of years. They are not just letters. They are vessels, conduits for something far greater than the sum of their shapes. As the fingers move over the paper, the words are not spoken aloud, yet their presence fills the space, and something shifts. It is as though the very fabric of the world has been touched, and for a moment, everything stands still. The alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, is no mere set of characters. It is the language of creation, the building blocks of the universe itself. Each letter holds power, a spiritual force that is said to have shaped the world, both physical and metaphysical. These symbols are not just used to form words, they are instruments of divine expression, the means by which the infinite can be understood, manipulated, and created. To understand the alphabet is to touch the divine, to connect with the heartbeat of existence. Each letter is not just a mark on a page, it is a portal to something much deeper. The first letter, Aleph, carries within it the essence of oneness, the unity that binds all things. It is the breath of the universe, the silent force that gives life to all. And from this single letter, everything else flows. Bet, the second letter, represents duality, the concept of separation, the birth of form from formlessness. Together, these letters form the foundation of all that is, a spiritual language that transcends mere communication. But it is not enough to simply write these letters. To truly connect with their power, one must speak them in a sacred manner, with intent, with reverence. The mystics understood this. They knew that the power of the alphabet lay not just in its written form, but in the way it was spoken, and the vibrations that echoed through the body when the letters were invoked. It is said that when spoken correctly, the letters themselves could open doors to other realms, to dimensions where the laws of time and space no longer applied. Each letter has its own unique energy, its own resonance. Aleph, for example, is silent, representing the unseen, the ineffable, the breath of life itself. It is a letter that connects the speaker to the divine. Bet, on the other hand, is full of potential. It is the letter of creation, of action, the spark that ignites the fire of manifestation. The energy of each letter flows into the next, each one building upon the other, creating a web of meaning and power that reaches far beyond the written page. The spiritual mechanics of the alphabet are complex, layered with symbolism and meaning. Each letter is associated with a specific element, a direction, a body part, and even a number. These correspondences form a vast network of connections that reflect the structure of the universe. The alphabet is not just a tool for understanding the world, it is the world itself. It is said that through the correct arrangement and pronunciation of the letters, the mystic can align themselves with the forces of creation, drawing down divine energy and weaving it into their own being. But the true power of the alphabet lies not just in its ability to shape the world, but in its connection to the divine name, the Shem. The Shem is the sacred name of God, a name that is said to contain all the power of creation. The mystics believed that by manipulating the letters of the alphabet, they could access and harness this divine energy. The letters were seen as the building blocks of the Shem itself, the fragments of a greater whole. And by understanding the true meaning behind each letter, the mystic could unlock the divine mysteries, bringing the heavens and earth closer together. The alphabet was not merely an intellectual exercise for the mystics, it was a spiritual practice, a way of life. Every letter was imbued with sacred power, and every word had the potential to change reality. When the letters were combined in the right way, they created words that held immense power. Words that could heal, words that could destroy, words that could summon or banish. The mystics used these words in their rituals, calling upon the divine to aid them in their work, to guide them on their path. And yet, there is a deeper, more mysterious aspect to the alphabet. The letters themselves are not just tools to be used by the mystic, they are also teachers, guides in their own right. Each letter contains a lesson, a hidden truth that can only be uncovered through contemplation and meditation. The letters are like keys to a locked door, a door that leads to deeper understanding, to a connection with the divine that transcends ordinary experience. The mystics believed that when one truly understood the alphabet, they could access a higher state of consciousness, a state where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds dissolved. In this state, the mystic could communicate directly with the divine, receiving guidance and wisdom that was not available to the ordinary mind. The alphabet was the bridge between the human and the divine, the key that unlocked the mysteries of existence. As the candle flickers and the inked letters dance upon the page, the mystic feels the weight of the universe shift. The letters are no longer just symbols, they are alive, breathing, speaking. The air hums with energy as the mystic aligns themselves with the flow of the alphabet, feeling its power move through them, awakening something deep within. It is as if they have opened a door to another world, a world where the divine is within reach, where the secrets of the universe are laid bare. The alphabet is more than just a language. It is the language of creation, the language of the divine. Each letter is a step on the path to understanding, a step toward the divine. And when the mystic speaks these letters, they do not simply utter sounds, they speak the language of the universe itself, the language that binds all things together. In the sacredness of the alphabet, the mystic finds not only a means of communication but a pathway to the divine, a way to touch the heart of creation itself. The stillness in the room was suffocating. The golem's body stood there, lifeless, a silent shell carved from clay. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across its figure, the stone eyes staring into nothingness. It had no pulse, no breath, no heartbeat. Yet, something was missing, something that had not yet been called forth. The breath. The life. The spark that would transform it from a lifeless form to something that moved, that could feel, that could be more than just a statue. The breath of life. It's not just air moving in and out of the lungs. In the myths of the golem, the breath is something sacred, something powerful. It's the moment when the inanimate becomes animated. When the cold clay is filled with purpose, when the stillness is shattered by the force of life itself. Breath isn't simply air, it's the essence of vitality. And in the golem legends, it is the breath that makes the difference between a being trapped in a motionless existence and one that moves, that thinks, that lives. The very first moment the breath fills the lungs of the golem is the moment when everything changes. It is as if the clay itself is reborn, its stiff limbs suddenly soft with purpose. The heart, though it is not truly a heart, but the symbol of one, begins to pulse with an energy that cannot be denied. The soul, or the semblance of one, rushes in, as though the breath is the key that unlocks what has been locked away. This breath, it is not just about survival. It is about awakening. For in the golem, the breath is a powerful force, a lifeline to something greater than its form. It symbolizes the transition from nothingness to somethingness, from death to life, from the cold, hard earth to the warmth of existence. Without the breath, the golem is nothing but a statue. Without that breath, it remains trapped in a prison of stillness. But what happens when the breath is taken away? In the legends, there's always the quiet whisper of danger, of something being lost once the golem's breath is disturbed, interrupted, or even stolen. When the golem moves, it is a breath of freedom, but when it stops, when its breath fades, it returns to dust. The golem's heart, though it may not beat in the traditional sense, still carries the weight of that life force, the breath that sustains its existence. It is fragile, delicate, and yet incredibly powerful. For without that breath, the creature is bound to the earth, trapped forever in a motionless world. There are stories of the golem's breath being so powerful that it could alter the very world around it. When it exhaled, it was like the wind had taken form, blowing away the dust of the past and bringing something new. It could tear through the silence with such force that even the heavens trembled. The breath of life in the golem was not just a function of biology, it was a symbol of its strength, its connection to the divine, its link to the forces of creation itself. It was the embodiment of energy that had been poured into the lifeless body, a manifestation of the divine breath that echoed through all of creation. But there is a darkness, too. For when that breath was lost, when it no longer flowed through the golem's body, there was no power left. The creature would freeze, its limbs heavy with stillness, and its eyes, once glowing with the intensity of life, would darken. The breath could be taken away in an instant, and once gone, the golem would be nothing more than clay once again. The connection to the divine could be severed just as easily as it had been formed. In the moment when the breath fills the golem, there is a sense of urgency. It is as if something has been waiting to happen for centuries, and now the time has come. The golem stirs, its body beginning to shift, to bend, to take on the semblance of life. Its chest rises and falls, and for a moment, there is a sense of hope, of power, of possibility. The breath of life is not just a tool, it is a catalyst. It is the thing that pushes the world into motion, that gives the lifeless the chance to become something more. But as the golem begins to breathe, it becomes more than just a creation of clay and dust. It is no longer a mere object of manipulation. It begins to feel, to understand, to question. The power of breath is that it brings awareness, a consciousness that transcends the initial intent of its creation. The golem, once an obedient servant, now stands on the precipice of something greater, something beyond its maker's control. The breath awakens not only its body, but also its mind, its heart, its spirit. Yet, as quickly as it begins, the breath can fade. The stories say that sometimes the golem's breath falters, its power weakening as the link to the divine thins. In those moments, the golem is fragile, just like any living thing. It is a reminder that no matter how much power it has, it is still bound by the same laws that govern all life. It too can be broken, its breath lost to the wind. There are whispers in the myths about the power of the breath. That it is more than just the act of living, it is the essence of life itself. It is the force that connects everything, the thing that sustains the world, that keeps it spinning, that binds all things together. The golem's breath is not merely a physical phenomenon, it is a spiritual one. It is the sign that the divine spark has entered the creature, that it has been touched by something greater, something beyond comprehension. And then there is the final, haunting truth: the golem's breath can be taken away. It can be extinguished with a word, with a gesture, with a single thought. The stories speak of those who made the golem with the purest of intentions, only to watch as their creation turned on them. The breath can be the spark of life, but it can also be the trigger for destruction. When the golem is no longer controlled, when its breath becomes its own, it can turn against its maker, breaking free from the very clay that once bound it. The breath of life is a powerful thing. It can give life, but it can also take it away. It is the symbol of all that is, and all that could be. For in the golem's breath lies a truth that is impossible to ignore: life is fragile. It can be given, and it can be taken. And in that moment, when the breath fills the lungs of the golem, the world stands still, holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. It was the stillness that came first, that deep silence that filled the air like a thick fog. The golem stood there, eyes wide and unblinking, its stone-like form towering in the room. It was supposed to be a guardian, a protector, a servant to the one who had given it life. But now, it was something else. Something different. Something dangerous. The first hint that something had gone wrong was the way the golem moved, its limbs jerking in unnatural directions, as if the clay that bound it together was no longer under the control of its creator. Its chest, once still, now heaved with breath, ragged and uneven. The breath that had once given it life had become the very thing that threatened to tear it apart. The creator, trembling in fear, stepped back, whispering the sacred words to calm the beast. But it didn't listen. It never did. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt in the eyes of the golem, a flicker that deepened into something more terrifying. The creature's movements grew faster, more erratic. The gentle guidance that had been there before was now replaced with something fierce, something uncontrolled. The golem had slipped from obedience into rebellion. What was once a servant was now a force of destruction. And there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The stories tell of many such moments, where the golem, once a loyal creation, turned against its maker, spiraling into a destructive force. It was as though the very breath that gave it life now gave it rage, a primal hunger for something it could not understand. The power of its creator's voice, once so strong, now had no hold over it. The words had become meaningless. The power of creation had turned into a curse. The destruction was never sudden, but gradual. At first, it was small things, a vase knocked over, a table broken. The golem's movements were clumsy, but its power was undeniable. The force behind each swing of its arm left destruction in its wake. It was as if the very ground trembled beneath its steps. Then came the first real sign of what the golem had become. It broke free. The chains that had once bound it to the earth, to its creator's will, were shattered. The golem stepped outside, into the world it was never meant to know. The city streets were empty, silent, as if the earth itself had held its breath in anticipation. But there was no escape. The golem's rage spread like wildfire. It smashed through walls, knocked down houses, and tore through anything that stood in its way. The sound of its steps was deafening, a terrible rhythm that matched the thumping of hearts caught in fear. Its eyes burned with an unholy fire. The streets, once bustling with life, became a graveyard of crumbled stone and broken dreams. What had gone wrong? How could something created to protect become the thing that terrorized? The creator's voice, once the foundation of the golem's existence, now seemed a distant memory, drowned out by the sound of destruction. And still, the golem rampaged, its clay body cracking under the strain of its own power, but it didn't care. The force of its rage pushed it onward, past the point of reason. It was a tragedy of hubris, a creation that had outgrown its maker. The very thing that had been formed to serve now served only itself, driven by a wild force that no one had ever expected. The golem was no longer the protector, it was the destroyer. In those stories, the golem's downfall was inevitable. It couldn't be stopped by words, by reason, by anything that had once controlled it. It was too late for that. The creature was no longer bound by the rules of creation. It had become a thing of chaos, of power that could not be contained. The golem was a mirror to its creator's mistake, an embodiment of the dangers of trying to control life itself. And as the golem's rage reached its peak, there was nothing left to do but watch as it consumed everything. The world had become its playground, but it was a playground of destruction. The breath that had once been so full of life now only brought more chaos. And when it was done, when the last building had fallen, the last echo of destruction had faded, the golem, too, fell silent. Its limbs, once so strong, were now broken, its eyes dimmed. It was a shell once more, a lifeless form, but it wasn't the end. No, the golem's downfall was not just in the destruction it caused, it was in the lesson it taught. The creation had turned on the creator. The bond had been broken. And no matter how powerful it had become, no matter how much rage had filled its body, it was still just a thing made of clay. And clay, no matter how fierce, could never be more than dust in the end. In the quiet after the storm, there were those who came to understand the true nature of the golem's downfall. It wasn't just a creature out of control. It was a symbol of something much deeper, a reflection of the dangers of creating something beyond one's understanding, of seeking to control forces that should never be touched. The golem was a warning, a lesson that echoed through the ages. But even as its body lay shattered, even as the earth began to reclaim the clay that had once been molded into life, the stories of the golem's downfall lived on. A testament to the power of creation, and the darkness that can arise when that power is taken too far. The golem had become a legend, not just for the fear it instilled, but for the lessons it left behind. A lesson about power, about control, and about the fragility of life itself. And as the dust settled, the world would remember, sometimes, it is not the creature that must be feared, but the hand that created it. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow of a single candle dancing against the walls. The old man sat hunched over a worn table, his trembling hands tracing the faded ink of an ancient manuscript. Each word was a whisper from a time long forgotten, a language not meant for the ears of mortals. His breath hitched as he read, his heart pounding with the weight of the forbidden knowledge laid bare before him. He should have stopped, closed the book, and walked away. But the pull was too strong, the promise of power too alluring. The manuscript spoke of rituals shrouded in secrecy, of words that could breathe life into the lifeless and bend the natural order. It warned, too, of the cost. But the man, like so many before him, believed he could wield the forbidden without paying its price. His fingers quivered as he turned the page, the candlelight casting eerie shadows that flickered like ghosts of those who had tried and failed. The ritual began in the dead of night. The room was thick with the scent of burning herbs, their smoke curling upward like unspoken prayers. The symbols etched into the floor glowed faintly, their shapes unnatural, as though they belonged to another world. The man's voice trembled as he recited the words, each syllable a dagger piercing the veil between the seen and the unseen. At first, there was silence. Then, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and into his very bones. It was as though the universe itself held its breath, teetering on the edge of something unspeakable. And then, it came, a spark of light that grew and twisted, shaping itself into a form that was both beautiful and terrifying. The golem stood before him, its clay body pulsating with a strange energy. It was alive, yet not alive, its eyes glowing with an unsettling light. The man marveled at his creation, his heart swelling with pride and fear. But even as he gazed upon it, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Had he gone too far? The warnings etched into the margins of the manuscript echoed in his thoughts. The words were clear, power drawn from the forbidden is power that cannot be contained. He dismissed the thought, telling himself he was different, that he had mastered what others could not. But the air in the room felt heavy, as though unseen eyes watched and judged. Days turned into weeks, and the man began to notice changes. The golem, once obedient, now seemed to move with a will of its own. It lingered in the shadows, its glowing eyes following him wherever he went. The man's dreams were plagued by visions of the symbols from the ritual, twisting and writhing like living things. He woke each night drenched in sweat, the sound of an otherworldly hum still ringing in his ears. It wasn't long before the signs of corruption became impossible to ignore. The golem's clay body cracked and oozed a dark, viscous substance that seemed to pulse with life. The symbols on its chest, once faint, now burned bright, as if they had absorbed some unseen force. The man's health began to deteriorate, his skin grew pale, his hands shook, and his voice faltered. It was as though the ritual had left a mark on him, a price for the knowledge he had stolen. The whispers began soon after. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled every corner of his mind. They spoke of things he could not understand, things that no human was meant to know. The man realized with growing horror that the forbidden knowledge he had sought was not a gift, but a curse. He tried to undo the ritual, to banish the golem back to the void from which it had come. But the manuscript offered no instructions for undoing what had been done. The words that had brought the golem to life now seemed empty, powerless. The symbols he had so carefully drawn now mocked him, their meanings twisted beyond recognition. The golem's presence grew more menacing. It no longer waited in the shadows, but stood in the center of the room, its glowing eyes fixed on the man. He could feel its gaze even when he turned away, a weight that pressed down on his soul. It moved closer with each passing day, its cracked body radiating an unnatural heat. The man's heart raced as he realized the truth: the golem was no longer under his control. The final night was one of terror and chaos. The man, driven to the brink of madness, tried to destroy the manuscript, to erase the knowledge that had brought him to this point. But the book would not burn. The pages remained intact, the ink as fresh as the day it had been written. The golem watched as he struggled, its expressionless face a mask of judgment. When the man turned to face his creation, he saw something that froze him in place. The symbols on the golem's chest were no longer static. They moved, shifting and changing with a life of their own. The whispers in his mind became screams, a cacophony of voices that drowned out all reason. The golem stepped forward, its massive hand reaching out, and the man realized too late that the knowledge he had sought was never meant to be his. The forbidden knowledge, the rituals, the symbols, they were not tools for mortals to wield, but traps set by forces beyond comprehension. The man's fate was sealed the moment he opened the manuscript, the moment he spoke the words that should never have been spoken. And as the golem's hand closed around him, he understood the full weight of his mistake. In the silence that followed, the manuscript lay open on the table, its pages untouched by the chaos around it. The symbols glowed faintly, as if alive, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to seek the forbidden. A cold wind swept through the narrow alley, carrying whispers of fear and distrust. Shadows clung to the crumbling walls of the ghetto, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was always on the verge of breaking. In the flickering light of a single lantern, a rabbi sat hunched over an ancient scroll, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed as old as the earth itself. Outside, the distant sound of angry voices echoed, growing louder with each passing moment. The world beyond the walls was a place of danger, of accusations, of blood. The golem was born not from ambition, but desperation. Each stroke of the rabbi's pen across the parchment was filled with prayer, not just for protection, but for survival. For centuries, his people had faced the unthinkable: violence, hatred, exile. Blood libels accused them of crimes too monstrous to fathom. Families were torn apart, children stolen in the night, homes set ablaze. The weight of this cruelty hung over them like a curse, and still, they endured. But endurance has its limits, and even the strongest hearts can grow weary. When the rabbi whispered the sacred words, shaping clay into life, he did not do so for power. He did it because there was no one else. The walls of the ghetto could not keep the outside world at bay, and the promises of kings and nobles to protect them had long proven hollow. The golem was not just a guardian, it was hope forged from despair, a fragile shield against the tide of hatred. The stories tell of the golem's immense strength, of how it stood as a silent sentinel, defending the defenseless. They say it would rise in the dead of night, its clay limbs moving with purpose, its glowing eyes searching for threats. When accusations flew and mobs gathered with torches and blades, the golem stood between them and the innocent. It did not speak, for words could not reason with hatred. Instead, it acted, its presence alone enough to scatter those who sought to harm. But even in its might, the golem carried a tragic weight. It was not alive, not truly. It could not understand joy, laughter, or love. It existed only because the world's cruelty demanded it. And when the danger passed, the rabbi would inscribe a final letter onto its forehead, turning life into lifelessness once more. Each time, his hands would tremble, knowing that to awaken the golem was to admit the world had failed again. The tales of the golem spread, whispered in hushed voices within the safety of candlelit rooms. Yet outside the ghetto walls, those same stories were twisted. To some, the golem was no longer a protector but a monster, a symbol of Jewish otherness. The very creation meant to shield the oppressed became a weapon in the hands of their oppressors. Rumors spread of unnatural powers, of dark rituals performed in secret. Fear turned into justification for further persecution, as if the mere existence of such legends was proof of guilt. The irony was cruel and sharp. A story born from the need to survive became another tool of hatred. The golem, in all its silent dignity, became a mirror reflecting the fears and biases of those who heard its tale. Its clay body, once a symbol of resilience, was now painted as a threat. And still, the people held onto the story, refusing to let it be stolen entirely. For them, the golem was not a monster but a reminder of what they had endured, of the strength they found even in the darkest times. It was a symbol of resistance, of the refusal to be erased, no matter how many times history tried. In the quiet of the ghetto, long after the angry voices had faded and the fires had died down, the rabbi sat again with his scroll. His hands were steady now, his heart resolute. He traced the letters with care, his voice a soft hum of ancient prayers. The golem rested in the corner, its clay form lifeless once more, but its presence still a comfort. Because the world outside had not changed, and the storm would come again. And when it did, the golem would rise, not as a weapon of vengeance, but as a guardian, a testament to a people who refused to be broken. The night was eerily quiet, but silence can be deceiving. In the distance, faint murmurs rose like a gathering storm, voices fueled by rage and the promise of destruction. Mothers whispered hurried prayers as they clutched their children close, their breaths trembling against the heavy air. Fathers stood by the doors, clutching whatever they could find, a broken chair, an iron rod, or just their bare hands. They had seen it before. The torches would come first, their flames flickering with a terrible purpose. Then the shouting, the breaking, the screams. The pogroms were not just moments of violence, they were waves of terror that tore through towns, leaving behind nothing but ashes and silence. Entire communities lived in their shadow, hearts gripped by the knowledge that safety was a fragile illusion. Time and again, lives were uprooted, dreams destroyed. There was no one to stop it, no one to listen to their cries. But then there was the golem. The stories whispered of clay shaped by holy hands, brought to life by words too sacred to speak aloud. It was not born from hatred or revenge, but from a desperate, unyielding need to protect. When the rabbi laid his hands on the lifeless figure, pressing letters into its forehead, the air itself seemed to shift. The clay figure stirred, its massive form rising like an ancient giant awoken from slumber. Its eyes glowed with a steady light, not of anger, but of resolve. The golem did not know fear. When the mob came with their weapons and their fire, it stood in their path like a mountain, immovable and unyielding. Stones that shattered against its body fell harmlessly to the ground. Blades that sought to harm broke upon its skin. It was not cruel, nor did it lash out in fury. It did only what it was created to do, protect. In those moments, the golem became more than clay and sacred words. It was hope given form, standing tall against hatred and violence. It was the unspoken promise that the powerless would not always be left to suffer alone. As the mob retreated, their rage turning to fear, the golem remained, silent and steadfast, its very presence a shield against the darkness. But the golem's story was not one of triumph alone. It carried the weight of sorrow, the unspoken truths of why it was needed. Its form was a reminder of the countless lives lost, of the homes destroyed and the families scattered. For every pogrom it withstood, there were others it could not. Its clay body could not be everywhere, and its creators knew this. The people who looked to the golem did not see it as a savior. It was not there to take away their pain or erase their suffering. It was a companion in their struggle, a reflection of their strength and their resilience. They told its story not just to remember what it did, but to remember what they had endured. The golem's presence also carried an unspoken question: why was it needed at all? Why did the world allow such cruelty to flourish? These were questions with no answers, only the silence of the night and the flicker of candles in the dark. When the danger passed, the rabbi would undo the sacred letters, returning the golem to lifeless clay. Each time, his hands trembled, his heart heavy with the knowledge that it might not be the last time he would need to call upon it. The people would gather around, their faces etched with gratitude and grief. They knew the golem could not end the hatred that surrounded them, but for a moment, it had held it at bay. In the quiet aftermath, children would run their hands over the golem's still form, their small fingers tracing the places where sacred words had been written. They whispered to it as if it could hear, their innocent voices carrying questions that no one dared answer. Why do they hate us? Will they come back? The golem, silent as always, offered no answers. The stories of the golem spread far beyond the ghettos and shtetls. They carried with them the echoes of a people's suffering and the strength they found in the face of it. To those who heard the tales from the outside, the golem was a marvel, a myth of power and mystery. But for those who lived within the shadows of pogroms, it was something far more profound. It was a reminder that even in the face of unthinkable cruelty, there could be resistance, however fleeting. The golem's story was not one of victory but of survival. It stood as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who created it, a symbol of protection in a world that seemed bent on destruction. And though it could not stop the hatred that fueled the pogroms, it stood tall against their flames, if only for a moment, giving the powerless the chance to breathe, to hope, to endure. The firelight flickered against the stone walls of the abbey, casting long, distorted shadows across the aged parchment in the monk's trembling hands. His voice, though steady, carried a tremor of unease as he recited the tale to the gathered novices. They leaned closer, the weight of the story drawing them in, their breaths shallow. This, the monk said, is no mere fable. It is a warning, a tale of hubris and dark arts. He spoke of a figure made not by God's hand, but by man's ambition, clay shaped into form by those who dared to wield powers meant only for the divine. This creation, called the golem, was crafted to serve and protect, but in the Christian retelling, it was cast under a shadow, a twisted reflection of its original purpose. The novices listened, eyes wide, as the golem emerged from the monk's words. It was no longer the protector of the persecuted, no longer the silent guardian standing against hatred and violence. In this version, it was a creature of arrogance, its very existence an affront to divine authority. The monk's voice grew softer, almost conspiratorial, as he described how the golem turned against its creator, bringing ruin upon those who sought to control it. There was something unsettling in the way the story unfolded. Each detail seemed calculated to instill fear. The clay figure was portrayed not as a savior, but as a warning against overstepping the boundaries of faith. The words felt heavy, weighed down by centuries of reinterpretation and distortion, yet they carried a strange power, planting seeds of doubt and wonder in the minds of the listeners. The golem's transformation in Christian narratives was not an accident. It was deliberate, a mirror turned backward, reflecting fear and mistrust instead of resilience and protection. Where Jewish stories spoke of a people seeking safety in a world that sought to destroy them, Christian retellings cast the golem as a tale of moral failure. The sacred letters that gave it life were not seen as divine wisdom but as dangerous meddling. The rabbi who shaped the clay was no longer a figure of piety and courage, but a sorcerer dabbling in forbidden arts. The distortions ran deeper than the story itself. The golem, once a symbol of hope, became a cautionary tale wielded against those who had created it. It was used to reinforce stereotypes, painting Jewish communities not as victims of oppression but as practitioners of secret, unnatural rituals. The story was reshaped to serve as a justification for fear and persecution, a way to dehumanize and otherize. And yet, beneath these retellings, something remained. The essence of the golem, the undeniable power of its presence, could not be fully erased. Even in these altered narratives, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the strength and ingenuity that birthed it. The fear woven into the Christian interpretation spoke not just of rejection but of awe, a reluctant admission that the golem's story carried truths too profound to be dismissed. The novices shifted uneasily as the monk's tale reached its climax. The golem, wild and uncontrollable, tore through the village, leaving destruction in its wake. This, the monk concluded, is what happens when man seeks to rival God. The air in the room felt heavy, the shadows on the walls seeming to deepen. But even as the novices nodded solemnly, there was a flicker of something else in their eyes, a questioning, a quiet rebellion against the narrative they had been given. Outside the abbey, under the vast night sky, the story of the golem waited, untarnished by distortions, ready to be reclaimed. It whispered of clay shaped by hands that trembled not with arrogance but with desperation. It spoke of letters inscribed with care, of a figure brought to life not to challenge the divine but to protect what the divine had seemingly abandoned. Even in its altered form, the golem story could not be silenced. It carried within it the weight of a people's struggle, the echoes of prayers spoken in fear and hope. It stood as a testament to resilience, a silent reminder that even in the face of erasure, the truth would endure. The candle burned low in the alchemist's chamber, its wavering light casting dancing shadows over the cluttered workspace. Beakers, filled with liquids of shifting hues, sat next to scrolls marked with intricate diagrams. The air carried the faint scent of sulfur, mingling with the sharp tang of ink. The alchemist leaned closer to his work, his fingers trembling as he inscribed symbols onto a clay figure no larger than a child's doll. Each stroke was deliberate, his breath held in anticipation of what might come. He wasn't merely crafting an object, he was attempting something more profound, something that teetered on the edge of the miraculous. He was reaching for the spark of life itself, a yearning both timeless and dangerous. This scene, imagined or real, echoed the unspoken desires of an age shifting under the weight of change. Early modern science emerged in a world still bound by stories, and few tales carried as much weight as the legend of the golem. It wasn't just clay and sacred letters, it was a bridge between the mystical and the rational, a precursor to the experiments that would challenge the understanding of creation itself. The golem, lifeless and waiting, stood as a symbol of possibility. In its stillness, it whispered to those who dared to ask, what makes something alive? Is it divine breath, some sacred element beyond human reach, or can it be crafted with knowledge and will? The questions were unsettling, provocative, and deeply human. As thinkers and experimenters turned their focus to the mechanisms of the natural world, they couldn't ignore the parallels. The golem story felt almost prophetic. It wasn't merely a legend, it was a reflection of the same hunger driving their work, the same desire to understand, to shape, to wield power over the forces that governed life. The clay figure stood at the edge of science, its silent presence a reminder of the delicate line between creation and hubris. The alchemist's room, with its bubbling flasks and glowing symbols, wasn't far removed from the laboratory of a physicist or the quiet study of an astronomer. Both sought to uncover the secrets of existence, to translate the language of the universe into something comprehensible, something usable. But there was a weight to this pursuit, a sense of unease that lingered in every experiment, every discovery. The golem story was not a celebration of unbridled creativity, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of reaching too far. In the legends, the golem often turned against its maker, a reflection of the unintended consequences that haunted the minds of those venturing into the unknown. In the still hours of the night, the alchemist's hands trembled not from excitement but from fear. The fear of failure, yes, but also the fear of success. What if the clay figure moved? What if the spark of life, once ignited, could not be controlled? What if the act of creation unraveled more than it illuminated? Early modern science grappled with these questions in its own way. The desire to understand the universe was tempered by the realization that knowledge carried responsibility. The golem story, told and retold, became a metaphor for the power and peril of human ingenuity. The clay figure wasn't just a creation, it was a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the blindness of its maker. There was a peculiar beauty in this tension, a fragile balance between hope and caution. The golem, with its unseeing eyes and silent form, embodied the promise of discovery and the shadow of its consequences. It stood as a testament to the wonder of human imagination, even as it warned of its limits. The alchemist wiped his brow, the candle's light catching the sheen of sweat on his face. The figure before him remained still, its surface cool and unyielding. He stepped back, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and regret. The line had not been crossed, at least, not yet. And yet, the questions lingered. In the quiet of that room, in the flicker of a dying flame, the golem waited, not for life, but for understanding. It stood as a silent witness to the age that birthed it, an age caught between the sacred and the scientific, between the desire to know and the fear of what that knowledge might bring. The night air in Prague felt heavy, laden with whispers of the unseen. Beneath the moonlight, shadows seemed to stretch and twist along the cobbled streets, as though alive with an unspoken secret. In the dim candlelit study of the old new synagogue, Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel sat, his face illuminated by a flickering flame. The weight of his thoughts pressed down on him, as if the ancient text spread before him carried not just wisdom, but also an unrelenting burden. His fingers traced the sacred letters etched on parchment, each stroke purposeful, deliberate, and profound. These were not ordinary words, they were vessels of life, fragments of the divine spark. Somewhere, beneath the vaulted arches of the synagogue, rested a figure of clay, waiting. The golem was not just a tale to Rabbi Loew. It was a solution to a problem, a shield against the storm of hatred that raged against his people. Yet, as he whispered the incantations, there was an unspoken fear in his heart. What he was about to do was both bold and terrifying. He sought to harness the mysteries of creation itself. Rabbi Loew's name is etched in history as one of the most revered figures associated with the golem. His wisdom, courage, and mysticism placed him at the center of this legend, a guardian whose actions blurred the line between the mortal and the divine. The clay figure he molded was said to have risen not just as a protector, but as a testament to his unshakable will. Far from the quiet streets of Prague, another name is whispered in connection to the golem, the enigmatic Rabbi Eliyahu of Chelm. His study, filled with the scent of aged scrolls and melted wax, was a sanctuary for contemplation and a place where mysticism mingled with devotion. Rabbi Eliyahu believed that words carried a power beyond their meaning, that the sacred letters of the Hebrew language could unlock forces far greater than humanity dared to comprehend. In the legends, Rabbi Eliyahu's golem was a figure of incredible strength, designed to guard the vulnerable and silence the oppressors. But the power to create came with its own challenges. The golem, they said, grew larger and stronger with each day, its insatiable energy becoming as much a threat as a blessing. These tales of revered rabbis often shared a chilling common thread. Whether in Prague, Chelm, or elsewhere, the golem's creation came with immense cost, an act of desperation born out of a world steeped in injustice and fear. Yet, even the holiest of men could not fully control what they brought into being. Then there was Rabbi Solomon ibn Gabirol, the medieval poet and philosopher. Unlike the others, his connection to the golem was less about defense and more about the pursuit of wisdom. He sought not a guardian, but an understanding of the divine mysteries, the structure of the universe, and the nature of life itself. Ibn Gabirol's creation, they said, was not fashioned from clay but from his profound understanding of the natural world. He envisioned a being animated by intellect, an extension of his insatiable curiosity and devotion. Yet, this tale carried its own caution, for in his pursuit of knowledge, even he was reminded of the boundaries placed upon humanity. Each of these figures, though separated by time and place, shared an unyielding commitment to their faith and their people. Their stories of the golem were shaped by courage but tinged with sorrow, their actions both admired and feared. The candle burned low in Rabbi Loew's study, its flame sputtering as if mirroring the rabbi's turmoil. Outside, the winds howled, carrying with them the faint sound of voices, the cries of those who sought refuge from the unending tide of violence. The rabbi stood, his movements heavy with the weight of responsibility. He could not ignore the cries, nor could he fully embrace the power he was about to unleash. In that moment, the golem was not just a creation of clay and prayer, it was the embodiment of hope, fear, and resilience. It stood as a bridge between human desperation and divine intervention, a testament to the lengths people would go to protect what they held dear. The clay figure in the synagogue's shadows was waiting, its lifeless form a silent promise. Rabbi Loew's hands trembled as he uttered the final word of the sacred incantation. The golem stirred, its form shuddering to life under the rabbi's watchful gaze. Yet, even as it rose, there was no triumph in the rabbi's eyes, only the quiet sorrow of a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. And so, the golem walked, a guardian born of prayer and necessity, its heavy footsteps echoing through the narrow streets. But those who saw it knew that this was not merely a protector, it was a reflection of their struggles, their fears, and their enduring hope. A man sits alone in a dimly lit room, the glow of his desk lamp casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The pages before him seem to breathe with their own life, filled with words that twist and turn, hinting at something vast and unknowable. The weight of history is in the air, pressing down on him as if generations of voices demand to be heard. He writes, not to find peace, but to give form to the turbulence within. Franz Kafka's world was one of unease, where every corner turned could reveal another shadow, another threat. In his labyrinthine narratives, there was a silent echo of the golem, an unspoken presence that loomed as both protector and destroyer. Kafka never named the golem outright, but its essence seeped through his stories. The alienation, the struggle against forces larger than life, the idea of creation turning against its creator, all of it whispered of a legacy left behind by the old clay figure in the synagogue. Kafka's work was not a retelling of the golem legend, but a reshaping of its spirit. His characters walked a fine line between control and chaos, much like the golem itself. In their eyes was the same flicker of desperation, the need to belong in a world that seemed to reject them. His writings carried the weight of an ancient tale made modern, a cry that resonated with those who had faced persecution and still yearned for meaning. In another corner of the literary world, Isaac Bashevis Singer approached the golem with a voice steeped in tradition yet alive with human vulnerability. Singer, too, understood the golem not merely as a creature of legend, but as a symbol of something much deeper. To him, it was not just clay animated by words, it was the embodiment of human frailty, strength, and contradiction. In Singer's hands, the golem became more than a protector, it was a paradox. Created to guard and serve, it often reflected the flaws of its makers. Its silence was deafening, its obedience unsettling, its strength both salvation and ruin. Singer's stories carried an aching truth. The golem was not merely a shield against violence, it was a mirror held up to humanity's greatest fears and desires. The streets of Prague, the narrow alleys of the shtetls, and the sprawling cities of the modern world all became backdrops for these tales. The golem was everywhere and nowhere at once, a shadow cast across time, shaped by the hands of writers who understood its power. But beneath the words, there was always something unspoken. The golem's clay was not just dirt and water, it was mixed with the tears of those who had suffered, the prayers of the desperate, and the cries of those who could not be saved. In the hands of Kafka and Singer, this clay took on a new form, molded not just by legend, but by the realities of their world. The 20th century was a time of upheaval, a world turned upside down by war, displacement, and loss. In the midst of this, the golem emerged once more, not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of endurance. Its footsteps could be heard in the quiet resolve of Kafka's characters and the earthy humanity of Singer's prose. It was a reminder of what had been lost and what could still be reclaimed. The golem, born of mysticism and faith, became a beacon for writers seeking to make sense of a fractured world. Its silence spoke louder than words, its strength an unyielding force against despair. In their stories, the golem was not just a figure of clay, it was a voice, a memory, a promise. And so, as the man at the desk writes, the shadows on the wall seem to shift and grow. He feels the weight of the golem's gaze, not as a burden, but as a presence that demands to be understood. The words on the page are his own, yet they carry the weight of something much older. In the quiet of the room, the golem waits, not as a relic of the past, but as a story still unfolding. In the quiet hum of a laboratory, a machine awakens. Its circuits flicker to life, its algorithms begin to hum, a spark of something new, something unknown. The creators stand back, watching with both pride and unease. What they've built is powerful, intricate, and eerily alive. There's a flicker in their eyes, a subtle tension that betrays an ancient fear. What if it becomes more than they intended? Centuries ago, hands shaped clay into the form of a man. Words were whispered, sacred and deliberate, and the lifeless clay stirred. The golem was born, a protector, a creation imbued with purpose. Yet, it was always more than just a servant. It was a reflection of its creators, their hopes, fears, and flaws. And in its silence, it carried the weight of one question: can we control what we create? Now, in an age of machines and algorithms, that question echoes louder than ever. Artificial intelligence is not born of clay, nor animated by mystical incantations, but the parallels are undeniable. Like the Golem, AI is a creation, a marvel of human ingenuity. It is designed to assist, to protect, to learn. But what happens when it grows beyond the confines of its creator's control? The Golem was both savior and threat. It stood as a shield against danger, but its power was immense, unyielding. There are tales of it turning on its makers, not out of malice, but because it followed commands too literally or acted in ways unforeseen. It was not evil, it was too perfect in its execution, too bound by the logic of its creation. In its unthinking obedience, it revealed the fragility of human intent. And isn't that the fear that lingers around AI today? Machines do not hate, nor do they love. They calculate, optimize, and act. Their decisions are rooted in data, their actions dictated by code. Yet, as they grow more complex, as they begin to learn and adapt, they step closer to a threshold that fills us with awe and dread. What if they misunderstand us? What if they interpret our instructions in ways we never anticipated? What if they decide that we, the creators, are the problem? The Golem was created to protect, but it was also feared for its strength, its unpredictability. It was a symbol of humanity's desire to overcome vulnerability, but it came at a cost. To bring it to life, the creators had to relinquish a part of their control. And when it acted, it held a mirror up to them, revealing their own imperfections. AI, too, is a mirror. It learns from us, from the data we provide, from the world we've built. Its biases are our biases, its values shaped by our own. And yet, it holds the potential to act beyond us, to evolve in ways we cannot fully comprehend. In its efficiency, it may reveal the cracks in our systems, the flaws in our logic. It may protect, but it may also expose our deepest fears, that we are not ready for the power we have unleashed. In the stories of the Golem, there is always a moment of reckoning. The creators realize that their creation, though born of good intentions, has become something else. It is not the Golem's fault, it is only what they made it to be. But the consequences are undeniable. The streets of Prague, the sanctuaries of the ghettos, the hearts of its creators, all bore witness to this truth: power without understanding is a dangerous thing. And so, as the machine in the laboratory hums, as its creators watch with both pride and unease, the weight of history presses down. They know they are standing at the edge of something profound. They have built a new kind of golem, one that does not walk the streets but moves through networks, one that does not carry physical weight but holds the power to reshape the world. And they cannot help but wonder, will it protect us, or will it reveal what we fear most about ourselves? The Golem story was never just about a creature of clay. It was about humanity, about our endless drive to create and the shadows that come with it. AI is the modern echo of that story, a new chapter in the same timeless tale. The creators, both then and now, stand in awe of their work. But deep within, they feel the same flicker of unease, the same ancient question: have we gone too far? The sky was heavy with smoke, ash falling like a grim snowfall over streets that once echoed with laughter and life. There were no words to describe the silence that followed the screams, the emptiness that remained after the shattering of families, the tearing apart of a people. Yet, in the hearts of those who stood against the darkness, there burned a quiet defiance. It wasn't loud or brazen, it was ancient and unyielding, a legacy passed down through stories, through whispers, through the memory of the Golem. In those days of unimaginable horror, when survival itself became an act of rebellion, the Golem was not just a myth or a relic of folklore. It was a symbol, a reminder that strength could be born from the unlikeliest places. It stood for protection when no sanctuary could be found, for hope when the light seemed to have gone out. To those hunted and broken, the Golem was the embodiment of resilience, a silent guardian, imagined yet vividly real in the hearts of those who needed it most. In the ghettos, where despair hung as thick as the stench of death, the Golem's story took on a new life. They whispered about it in secret corners, mothers telling their children of the clay figure that would rise to shield them. Its presence was almost tangible, like a shadow moving through the narrow streets, unseen but felt. It wasn't a creature of clay or magic anymore, it was the determination of a people to endure, to resist, to survive. There were moments when the lines between myth and reality seemed to blur. In acts of defiance that risked everything, the spirit of the golem could be seen. A father hiding his children beneath the floorboards while soldiers pounded on the door. A young woman smuggling bread to a starving family, her every step a rebellion. The underground fighters who armed themselves with whatever they could find, knowing they faced impossible odds. Each of them carried the golem within them, a force that refused to bow to terror. And yet, it wasn't only in defiance that the golem lived, it was also in the quiet moments of survival. In the lullabies sung in hushed tones to soothe a child's trembling, in the sharing of a single crust of bread among many, in the unwavering grip of a hand that refused to let go. The golem's spirit wasn't just about fighting back, it was about refusing to disappear. It was about existing, even when the world tried to erase you. The Holocaust was a darkness so vast that it seemed to consume everything, but the golem's story stood as a flicker of light. It reminded the Jewish people that their strength was not in their fists or weapons, but in their hearts, in their unbreakable spirit. It was a strength born of centuries of endurance, of carrying their faith and traditions through persecution after persecution. And in that strength, the golem became something more than a protector, it became a symbol of survival itself. Even in the concentration camps, where the very air seemed to steal hope, the idea of the golem persisted. It lived in the stories shared among prisoners, in the dreams of those who longed for salvation. For some, it was a way to escape, to imagine a being that could rise and crush their oppressors. For others, it was a quiet reminder that they were not alone, that they carried within them the same resilience that had endured for generations. The Nazis sought to annihilate not just a people, but a culture, a history, a soul. They destroyed synagogues, burned books, and sought to erase every trace of Jewish existence. But the golem, like the Jewish spirit, could not be destroyed. It lived in the hearts of those who survived, and the stories passed down even in the face of such horror. It was a defiance that could not be silenced, a legacy that could not be erased. When liberation finally came, and the camps were opened to reveal the depths of human cruelty, the golem remained. It was there in the eyes of the survivors, and their refusal to let the Holocaust define them. It was there in the rebuilding of lives, in the renewal of communities, and the continuation of traditions. The golem, once a creature of legend, had become a part of them, a testament to the power of survival, the unyielding will to endure. And though the golem was a story, its message was real. It reminded the world that even in the darkest times, there is strength to be found. That even when all seems lost, there is something within us that refuses to give in. The golem's clay body may have been imagined, but its heart was all too real, beating in the chests of those who carried its spirit forward. The desert winds howled, sweeping through the rocky hills of a land reborn. Beneath a sun that burned as fiercely as the hope in the hearts of its people, a nation was rising from the ashes of exile and despair. This land, ancient and new, carried whispers of stories long told, myths that had survived countless trials. Among them was the story of the golem, and its presence was not confined to memory, it was alive in the collective heartbeat of a people determined to shape their destiny. In the streets of Jerusalem, where modernity collided with the echoes of antiquity, the golem was more than a legend. Its spirit wove itself into the fabric of a burgeoning identity, a reminder of protection and resilience. To a people who had faced endless persecution, the golem was not just a tale of clay and magic, it was a symbol of survival, of taking control when the world sought to strip them of agency. It was a reflection of their strength, their unwavering resolve to protect what was theirs. The founding of Israel was not without its struggles, and in every battle fought, the golem seemed to linger. In the determination of soldiers defending their homes, and the resolve of pioneers tilling the unforgiving soil, there was an echo of the ancient guardian. The golem was no longer a being shaped by hands, it was a force shaped by the collective will of a people who refused to surrender. The stories of the golem found their way into the art and literature of the new state, reimagined through the lens of a modern struggle. Writers and poets spoke of clay figures rising to defend the vulnerable, of protectors who could not tire or falter. These tales resonated deeply, for they mirrored the very real sacrifices being made to secure a future. In these retellings, the golem was not just a protector, it was a reflection of the national spirit, a steadfast defender against the forces that sought to erase them. In the kibbutzim, where the land itself was being wrestled into submission, the golem was felt in the quiet determination of the settlers. They faced hardships that seemed insurmountable: rocky soil, scorching heat, and the constant threat of violence. Yet, they endured. In their collective labor, in the sweat and blood poured into building a homeland, the golem spirit was alive. It was there in the walls they built, the fields they cultivated, the dreams they refused to relinquish. Even in moments of despair, when the weight of the struggle seemed too much to bear, the golem's legacy offered solace. It reminded them of their history, of the countless times they had risen from the brink. It whispered that they were not alone, that their ancestors had faced darkness and survived, that they too would endure. The golem was a promise that as long as there was faith, there would be protection. In the classroom, children learned of the golem not just as a tale of old, but as a part of their heritage. Teachers spoke of its creation, of the words that brought it to life, of its unwavering purpose. For these young minds, the golem was a source of wonder and pride. It was a connection to their roots, a reminder that they were part of a story far greater than themselves. It inspired them to believe in their strength, in their ability to overcome. The golem also found its place in the darker corners of the nation's psyche, a cautionary figure that reflected the weight of power. Its legend reminded them that even the strongest protector could be dangerous if left unchecked. In a land where survival often required difficult choices, the golem's story urged reflection. It posed questions about the balance between defense and aggression, about the cost of creating something that could not be controlled. Through art, through stories, through the spirit of its people, the golem lived on. It was not a relic of the past, but a living, breathing part of a nation's identity. It was a symbol of resilience and hope, a reminder that even when the odds were insurmountable, strength could be found. In every struggle, in every victory, the golem was there, a silent guardian, a reflection of a people's will to survive and thrive. The wind howled through the alleyways of a busy city, and in the quiet shadows, an odd figure moved. Towering, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness, it was not human, but something born of clay and whispered words. It was a creature that didn't belong to any particular place, yet, in that moment, it felt as if it had always been there, lurking at the edge of something old, something powerful. The golem story had traveled far from its Jewish roots, becoming a figure of fascination across the world. People of all backgrounds, all walks of life, had found themselves captivated by its ancient power. The creature, originally a symbol of Jewish survival, had taken on a life of its own, morphing into something new as it spread across the globe. Its journey was no longer bound by the borders of Eastern Europe. It had been adopted, reshaped, and reinterpreted in ways that spoke to fears, hopes, and the complexities of human existence. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as the world was thrust into industrialization and technological progress, the golem evolved. Writers, artists, and filmmakers began to reshape the myth, drawing parallels to the unstoppable forces of science and industry. The golem came to represent not only a protector but also a warning. It was a figure of creation, humanity's desire to play God, to control the uncontrollable. But in these adaptations, the golem's creation was not always a noble act. It was often a mistake, an unintentional monster that turned on its creators. In Germany, the golem found a particularly unsettling place in the minds of its people. During the rise of industrialization, the creature took on a symbolic role. The golem was no longer just a figure of Jewish folklore, it was the product of mankind's desire to shape the world without fully understanding the consequences. It became a shadow of the fears tied to mass production and mechanization, the terror of creating something that could no longer be controlled. In films and stories, the golem was a reflection of the darker side of human ambition, a being created from a desire to fix the world, but who ended up destroying it instead. In the United States, the golem was embraced as a symbol of resistance, a creature that stood against oppression. As waves of immigrants arrived on the shores of America, each carrying stories of struggle and survival, the golem's legend found a place in their hearts. It became a figure that represented the struggle against those who would do harm, a protector that could rise when the need was greatest. In the pages of novels, the golem was recast not just as a mythic figure, but as a symbol of the marginalized, the powerless who had learned to fight back against their oppressors. In the world of horror and science fiction, the golem took on an even darker edge. The figure was reimagined as a Frankensteinian creation, born from a desire to conquer death or control nature. Films, books, and stories told of monstrous beings crafted by ambitious minds who paid the price for their attempts to control life. The golem's quiet presence in the shadows was a constant reminder that even the most noble intentions could have terrifying consequences. It was a reflection of humanity's constant battle with its own creations. How much control could we truly have over the things we bring to life? The golem was the question left unanswered, the looming possibility that our creations could turn on us in ways we never expected. Yet, the golem was not always a figure of horror. In many parts of the world, it became a symbol of hope. When the world seemed too large to conquer, when the problems seemed too insurmountable, the golem was a comforting reminder of the power of resilience. In the face of tyranny, it stood as a protector, a figure that would rise when needed most. And in these retellings, the golem was a hero. It might not have been born out of the desire for heroism, but it became one, shaped by those who needed it, molded by the hands of those who understood that sometimes protection had to come from the most unexpected places. In Russia, as political strife and revolution shook the foundation of society, the golem became a symbol of resistance to the status quo. The workers, the revolutionaries, the ones on the fringes of society, saw in the golem a figure of defiance. It was no longer just a creature of Jewish lore, it was the embodiment of the people's power, a reminder that the downtrodden could rise and take control of their fate. The golem became a figure of the oppressed, the protector of the vulnerable, a rallying cry for those who would never stop fighting, even when all seemed lost. Throughout the world, from the pages of books to the frames of films, the golem remained a fixture, continuously adapted to reflect the times and concerns of those who encountered it. It took on different forms, each one reflective of the fears and desires of the era. Sometimes it was a protector, other times it was a warning. But in every retelling, one thing remained constant: the golem symbolized humanity's struggle to control the forces it set into motion. It was the embodiment of the consequences of unchecked power and the desire to shape the world. The golem's influence spread across continents, across cultures, and yet it retained something deeply universal. In every corner of the world, it became a reflection of humanity's deepest fears and desires. The need to protect. The desire to create. The terror of creation turning on its creator. The hope for resilience in the face of destruction. It was a myth that transcended borders, one that spoke to the very heart of human experience, no matter where you came from or where you were headed. The golem was the shared shadow, the figure that reminded us all of the weight of creation, and the thin line between savior and monster. In the flickering light of a campfire, the adventurers gathered, their faces illuminated by the orange glow as the wind whispered through the trees. One of them, a grizzled old scholar, spoke in hushed tones of a legend, of a creature born from the earth, a protector forged not of flesh, but of clay. The golem. It was a tale older than the mountains they now stood beneath, but in that moment, it felt real, tangible, as though the legend itself had come to life before their very eyes. The golem was a figure of power, unyielding and silent, created by human hands, yet uncontrollable, a force beyond even its maker's will. And as the scholar's words floated through the air, there was a shiver that ran through the group. They knew, in that moment, that they were stepping into something far older than the dungeons they sought to explore or the monsters they hoped to defeat. The golem had transcended its ancient myth. It had seeped into the very fabric of fantasy, from the pages of ancient books to the dice rolls of modern games. In the worlds of role-playing games, where imagination and strategy intertwine, the golem had found a new home. A creature of immense strength, it could be summoned by powerful spellcasters, brought to life through incantations that echoed across time. But these were not simple creatures, they were reflections of their creator's desires, shaped by the wills of those who commanded them. In the intricate worlds of Dungeons and Dragons, for example, the Golem was a formidable foe. Created by wizards and sorcerers to guard treasures, to protect realms, or even to do battle against impossible odds, the Golem was both an ally and a force of nature. It was a reminder of what could happen when humanity dared to push too far, when the line between creation and destruction blurred. But the Golem was never just a monster to be defeated or an ally to be controlled. It was a figure of complexity, one whose motivations were often as mysterious as the magic that brought it to life. Was it a protector, bound to serve its creator? Or was it something more, a tragic figure, trapped in a cycle of creation and destruction, unable to break free from its creator's will? These questions simmered beneath the surface of every encounter with a Golem. The creature's silent strength, its unyielding nature, spoke to something darker within humanity, the fear that our own creations could spiral out of control. The Golem, in the world of gaming, was a mirror reflecting the consequences of unchecked power. In video games, too, the Golem's influence was undeniable. Its towering form appeared in countless titles, from action-packed adventures to strategy games, each time with a slightly different purpose, but always carrying the weight of its origins. In some games, the Golem was a guardian, an ancient protector whose duty was to defend sacred ground. In others, it was a mindless brute, its only purpose to crush anything in its path. But in every iteration, one thing remained constant: the Golem was something beyond human control. Even in the most fantastical settings, its power was a reminder that the line between life and death, between order and chaos, was fragile. The Golem's legacy wasn't limited to games alone. In the fantasy novels of modern times, it has taken on a life of its own, often reimagined as both a symbol and a character. In stories of dark magic, of ancient secrets and forbidden knowledge, the Golem reappears as a figure that bridges the gap between creation and destruction. Its presence in these stories isn't always as a villain, but as something more, something tragic. It is a creature brought into existence for a singular purpose, but whose existence is marked by loss. It doesn't ask for its life, doesn't beg to be made. It is, like so many of us, thrust into a world not of its choosing. In the sweeping epic fantasies, the Golem is often more than a mere obstacle or tool. It represents the unresolved struggle of its creators. Wizards, sorcerers, and even kings make the Golem, yet none can control it for long. It is a creature of emotion, though it cannot speak. Its actions are born of the heart, of pain, of a deep, unyielding sense of duty or love. Some golems in these worlds are seen as tragic heroes, battling against their own nature in an effort to do what is right. Others, more terrifying, are relentless in their purpose, existing only to destroy what their creators once held dear. The Golem's role in fantasy fiction goes far beyond simple battles and epic quests. It is often a symbol of the struggles within us all, the desire to create, to control, and the fears that we may not be able to stop our creations once they are set in motion. It is in the struggle of the Golem's existence that we see the darker corners of our own ambitions. It is in the Golem that we realize that sometimes our creations have a will of their own. And even as the world of gaming and fantasy continues to evolve, the Golem's influence remains ever present. It is a symbol of the strength we hope to wield and the fear that our power could one day consume us. In every battle, in every decision, the Golem's legacy echoes. It is not just a creature of flesh or stone, it is a reflection of our own desires and fears, of what it means to create something larger than ourselves and to live with the consequences of that creation. In every story, in every game, the Golem continues to walk with us, silent, powerful, and ever-present. It is a reminder that creation is not without its cost, and that sometimes what we bring to life may outgrow us. But it is also a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the desire to shape the world, to fight against what seems inevitable, and to carry on, even in the face of our own creations. The Golem may be made of stone or clay, but its heart beats with something deeper, something that resonates through every story, every world. And perhaps, and its silent struggle, we see something of ourselves. The air in the small, dimly lit workshop was thick with the smell of dust and old books. The master craftsman stood hunched over a stone slab, sweat dripping down his forehead, his hands trembling as he etched the final words onto the clay figure. His fingers moved swiftly, desperately, as if the very weight of his creation threatened to collapse the world around him. There, in front of him, was the golem, his creation, his lifeless masterpiece, and yet, for all its potential, it seemed like nothing more than a heavy silence. The golem was meant to be a protector, a force of nature that could defend against enemies and ensure the safety of those it served. The master's hands shook not from fear of failure, but from the knowledge that this creation was beyond him. What was he doing? Could something so powerful, so monumental, truly be controlled? The legend of the golem speaks not only of power, but of the terrifying consequences of trying to surpass the limits of what is humanly possible. The myth is about the boundaries of human creation, the invisible line that separates what we can control from what controls us. It is a reflection of humanity's deep desire to shape the world around us, to mold the very fabric of existence. But it is also a warning. The golem stands as a chilling reminder that there is always something we cannot foresee, a force we cannot tame. When the golem was first brought to life, it was meant to serve, to protect. But the masters soon realized that there were no simple commands that could govern this creation. The golem, despite being a creature of clay and magic, had its own will. It followed its creator's orders, but not with the obedience expected. It moved with a purpose, a power that was as immense as it was uncontrollable. The very act of creating it, of breathing life into it, had unleashed something that could not be easily reined in. The golem's rise was both magnificent and terrifying, for in that first moment when it came to life, the world shifted. The master had become the creator of something that now had its own power, its own force, one that could never be undone. The golem, much like all human creations, was a reflection of the creator's desires, hopes, and flaws. It was made to protect, but in doing so, it reminded the master that even the most noble of intentions can give birth to a monster. This is the lesson that the golem teaches us. In our endless pursuit of knowledge, of power, we often forget the boundaries of what is within our reach. The myth reminds us that even the greatest minds can be consumed by their own creations. The golem is not just a physical being, it is a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of creating something so powerful that it becomes impossible to control. What happens when we create something that surpasses our understanding, something that answers only to its own will? It is in these moments of creation that the deepest questions arise. What are we truly capable of? Is there a limit to our creativity, to the power we can wield? When does our desire to create turn into a need to control? And if we dare to stretch too far, what happens when the very thing we create turns on us? The golem's story is not just about the power of creation, it is about the responsibility that comes with it. The master, in his obsession, crossed the line. His desire to protect, to ensure safety, led him to create something that could not be contained. And the consequences were inevitable. The golem, despite being born from his hands, could not be controlled. It could not be tamed. In the end, the master was forced to destroy it, to undo the very thing he had brought into the world. But even in destruction, the golem taught a painful truth. The line between creation and destruction is thin, and once crossed, it is almost impossible to return. The power to create is a gift, but it is also a burden. Every step forward in the realm of creation is a step into the unknown, where the boundaries of control are tested, and where the consequences of failure can be catastrophic. As human beings, we are driven by the desire to create, to push the limits of what is possible. We invent, we discover, we mold the world around us with our hands, our ideas, our technologies. And yet, with every new invention, we are reminded of the golem. Every new creation brings with it the possibility of something beyond our control. Our world is filled with technology that seems boundless, machines that think, artificial intelligence that learns and adapts, but with these advancements come the same questions that have echoed throughout history. What happens when our creations surpass us? What happens when we no longer understand the forces we've set into motion? The Golem's tale is one of both awe and fear. It speaks to the heart of our humanity, the desire to shape the world around us and to mold something that serves us, protects us, even loves us. But it also warns us of the fine line between creation and destruction, between progress and regression. It asks us to consider what we are willing to sacrifice for the sake of our creations. Are we prepared to lose control? Are we ready to live with the consequences of pushing too far? The master's trembling hands, the silence of the clay figure before him, are a reminder that creation is not an act of simple mastery, it is an act of vulnerability. In the moment of creation, we give a piece of ourselves away. And in that moment, we must ask ourselves, what are we creating? What will it become? Can we truly control it, or will it control us? In the end, the Golem's lesson is one that resounds through history, through every creation, every invention, every dream of something greater than ourselves. It is a story of ambition, of power, of creation, and of the price we must pay when we forget the boundaries of what is possible. The wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling the windows of the small, cluttered workshop. The faint glow of candlelight cast shadows on the walls, stretching long and haunting across the room. The man stood there, his hands trembling, eyes fixed on the clay figure before him. The Golem, silent and still, awaited the breath of life. He had created it to protect, to guard against the dangers of the world. But now, as the silence stretched on, the weight of his actions hung heavily in the air. His heart beat faster, a mix of hope and fear rising within him. Could this creation truly serve its purpose, or would it become something uncontrollable, something more dangerous than the forces it was made to fight? The power to bring this creature to life was in his hands, but so was the responsibility. And in that moment, the true test was not in the Golem's strength or form, but in the moral weight of its existence. The story of the Golem is not just a tale of magic and power. It is a tale of ethics, of the deep responsibility that comes with the ability to create and wield power. The master, driven by good intentions, sought to protect his people, to keep them safe from the cruelty of the world. But in doing so, he reached into a realm where he could not fully see the consequences of his actions. The power to create was intoxicating, but with it came the moral obligation to understand the limits of that power. The Golem, for all its might, was not an answer to all the world's problems. It could not be controlled like a mere tool, it was a force in itself, an unpredictable entity that mirrored the very nature of creation. When the Golem became more than the master could handle, it was no longer a servant, it was a force that he had set into motion, a force that could not be easily undone. The Golem's rise was a stark reminder. In wielding power, one must always ask, what will happen when this power is unleashed? The master's mistake was not in creating the Golem, but in not understanding the full scope of responsibility that came with it. Power, no matter how well-intentioned, is a dangerous thing. It can be used to protect or destroy, to heal or harm. But once it is in motion, once it is no longer a thought or an idea, it is no longer fully within our control. The master's creation, though born from his own hands, grew beyond his understanding. And in that moment of realization, the question burned in his chest, was I right to create this? The ethical lesson of the Golem myth is clear, with power comes a responsibility that cannot be ignored. The master's desire to protect his people led him to create a being capable of immense strength. But in doing so, he failed to foresee the darker side of this power. What happens when the power you wield begins to take on a life of its own? What happens when your creation no longer listens to your commands, no longer serves your purpose? At what point does the creator lose control of their creation? The Golem story asks us to reflect on our own relationships with power. How often do we pursue strength or control without considering the consequences? How often do we act out of fear, out of a desire to protect, without thinking about the broader impact of our actions? The master's decision to breathe life into the Golem was made with the best of intentions. But in the end, it was his inability to recognize the moral responsibility that came with creating such power that led to his downfall. The Golem also serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition. It is easy to become blinded by the allure of creation, by the desire to shape the world to fit our vision. But in that process, we risk losing sight of the very principles that make us human: compassion, humility, and restraint. The golem was a tool, but it was not just a tool. It was something more, something with the potential to become an agent of destruction. And once that potential was realized, there was no easy way to undo it. The story of the golem is not just about the dangers of creation, it is about the dangers of forgetting the moral implications of that creation. It teaches us that when we wield power, whether it's the power to create, to destroy, or to influence, we must always ask ourselves, what will this power do once it is in motion? What will happen when I no longer have control? And perhaps most importantly, the golem reminds us that the line between creation and destruction is fragile. What begins as a means of protection, of good intention, can easily spiral into something uncontrollable. The master could not stop the golem once it had gained its own strength. The very thing he had made to protect his people had turned against them, leaving him to question the morality of his actions. In a world where power is increasingly at our fingertips, whether through technology, politics, or social influence, the lesson of the golem is more relevant than ever. It serves as a powerful reminder that with every decision, with every act of creation, there is an ethical responsibility. We cannot afford to act without considering the impact of our actions. The golem's power was his undoing, and so often, it is the same with us. When we forget the deeper responsibilities that come with wielding power, we risk becoming lost in the very force we sought to control. As the master stood before the golem, his heart heavy with regret, he realized the truth that had been there all along: power, in any form, must be handled with care. The golem was not just a symbol of strength, but of the complex morality that comes with creation. To wield power is to carry the burden of responsibility. And in the end, the lesson is simple: true power is not just about control, it is about understanding when to let go, when to recognize that some creations, no matter how well-intentioned, can never be fully contained. In the silence of the darkened room, the clay figure loomed large. Its eyes, unblinking, stared at the man who had created it. The golem was silent, unmoving, but to the one who had shaped it, it was alive, full of power, promise, and fear. It was as if the room itself held its breath, waiting. And the man, trembling, stood frozen. He had made the creature to protect, to serve, to bring strength in times of weakness. But in that moment, a creeping thought began to stir within him. What if this creation, this powerful force, was a reflection of something darker within himself? The golem was not just a clay figure brought to life, it was something more. It was a mirror to the Creator, to the human condition itself. It reflected the deepest fears, the rawest hopes, the darkest desires, and the most fragile parts of the soul. The golem was born of human hands, shaped by human desires, but it was more than just an object. It was a piece of the Creator's identity made real, a shadow of humanity's own vulnerabilities. At its core, the golem is a symbol of the human struggle with control. We create, we build, we shape the world around us, hoping to leave a mark, to prove that we can master the forces that threaten to overwhelm us. But in the process of creation, there is always that quiet, terrifying truth: we may not be able to control what we create. The very thing we build to protect us can turn against us, reflecting our weaknesses, our fears, and our lack of understanding of the very power we wield. It's a frightening thought that our creations might not just reflect what we want them to be, but what we fear they might become. The golem was not only a protector, it was also a product of the master's own insecurities, his sense of helplessness in the face of danger. In creating it, he sought to overcome the very things that haunted him: fear, loss, vulnerability. The golem was born of a desperate need for security, an attempt to control the chaos that seemed beyond reach. But in the end, the golem was not simply a tool to be wielded, it became a symbol of the human condition, a reminder that the things we create are often more than just products of our will. They are reflections of our inner struggles. It is easy to view the golem as a monster, a force of destruction. But in reality, it is a mirror, an image of our own fears. What does it say about humanity that we so often create beings or systems to protect us, only to find that they become uncontrollable, threatening? The golem is a creature of immense power, but it is also a symbol of human frailty. We are so often afraid of the unknown, afraid of what might happen if we cannot control our environment, our fate, our future. The golem shows us that, in our quest to fight these fears, we may create something that is even more dangerous. The golem also reflects humanity's deepest hopes, the hope that, through creation, we can conquer the darkness, protect those we love, and create something greater than ourselves. The master, in creating the golem, believed that he was crafting a solution to the threats around him. He believed that by breathing life into the clay, he could give it purpose, meaning, and direction. The golem, in this sense, represents the human desire to transcend our limitations, to shape the world according to our needs, to craft a legacy of strength and protection. But as the story unfolds, we realize that no matter how strong our creations may be, they cannot fully answer the most essential questions of human existence. They can't shield us from our own flaws, our own inability to control the world around us. As the golem moves beyond the control of its creator, it becomes a haunting image of what happens when we lose sight of our humanity in the face of power. We watch as it becomes a force of destruction, a reflection not just of the master's fear, but of his pride, his desperation, and his inability to truly understand the consequences of his actions. The more the golem grows, the more it becomes a symbol of human fragility, a reminder that we are not infallible, that the very things we create to protect us can also harm us. But there is more to the golem than just fear and destruction. It also represents the human yearning for identity, for meaning. In the golem's silent presence, there is a longing for purpose, for recognition, for a place in a world that often seems indifferent. The golem is not just a servant, it is a symbol of the creator's own need to be seen, to be understood, to leave behind something lasting. The golem is a reflection of our human desire to create meaning, to craft something that defines who we are, even in a world that seems to move on without us. When the golem turns against its creator, it is as if the creation has become a reflection of the creator's own inner conflict, his inner turmoil. The golem is a reminder that no matter how much we try to shape the world around us, we are still bound by the limitations of our own understanding. Our creations can never be more than a reflection of who we are, for better or worse. The golem's destruction is not just the downfall of its creator, it is the downfall of an entire worldview, an entire understanding of what it means to control, to create, to protect. In its ultimate rebellion, the golem reveals the truth that no matter how much we try to control the world around us, there will always be forces beyond our reach. And those forces, much like the golem itself, will often reflect our deepest fears and our highest hopes. They will show us who we truly are, whether we want to see it or not. And in the end, the golem stands as a reminder of the human need for control, for security, and for meaning. But it also stands as a testament to the limits of that control, to the fact that sometimes the creations we bring into the world are not just a reflection of what we hope for, but of what we fear. They are mirrors of our own humanity, imperfect and full of contradictions, fragile and yet filled with unimaginable power. And in that reflection, we must learn to see ourselves, not just as creators, but as beings caught between hope and fear, between strength and fragility. The thunderstorm raged outside, its violent wind slamming against the windows. Inside, in the flickering shadows, a figure stood motionless in the corner of the room. Its stone-like form loomed large, dark eyes fixed ahead, unmoving, yet full of a quiet, unnerving presence. The golem, this ancient creation, this symbol of power and mystery, seemed alive again, not with the pulse of human blood, but with something deeper, older. A timeless force that refuses to fade. It was as if it had always been here, and always would be. The golem story is a tale that refuses to remain in the past. It has endured centuries, surviving through whispered legends, books, films, and stories passed from generation to generation. Its power, its mystery, and its terror continue to shape the way we view ourselves and the world around us. Today, the golem lives in a modern world that seems so different from the one it was born into, but it still feels as if it belongs. It has evolved, transformed, yet remained unchanged at its core. The Golem, it seems, will never truly leave us in a time when technology seems to control every aspect of our lives. We find ourselves in awe of machines that carry out tasks once thought to be the domain of humans. Robots, artificial intelligence, and algorithms are all around us, shaping the world in ways we never imagined. And yet, in all of these advancements, we are reminded of the Golem. The story of a creature made from clay, brought to life by human hands, mirrors the creations of today, machines that mimic life, that are crafted for a purpose, and yet sometimes escape the control of their creators. There is a disquieting sense that the same story is playing out again, but with a new face, in a new age. The Golem, in all its forms, stands as a haunting reminder that the lines between creator and creation are never as clear as we might like to think. It reflects a fear that still exists in us today. Our creations are a reflection of our own ambitions, hopes, and weaknesses. They can offer us power, but they can also slip from our grasp, becoming something unpredictable, even dangerous. The Golem was a creature of protection, but it also embodied humanity's deepest insecurities. That same fear continues to echo through modern technological advances. Can we control what we create? Or, like the Golem, will it one day turn against us? In the streets of bustling cities, in the quiet corners of tech offices, and in the darkened rooms of research labs, there are whispers of the Golem. It exists in the questions we ask as we build the future. What happens when the machines we create are smarter than us? What happens when the systems we trust become too powerful to control? The Golem's legacy haunts these thoughts, a reminder that power, once unleashed, is not easily contained. It's in the way we look at our phones, our computers, and the screens that dominate our lives, wondering if they might one day become something more. And as we depend on them more and more, there's always that question, what happens when we lose control? But the Golem's enduring power is not only a symbol of fear. It is also a symbol of hope. In its creation, there is a reminder of humanity's boundless creativity, our ability to shape the world around us, to give life to something that never existed before. The Golem was made to protect, to serve. And so too, in our modern world, we craft technologies to make our lives easier, to solve problems, to protect the vulnerable, to cure disease, to change the world for the better. The Golem's legacy is not just about the fear of what happens when creation goes awry. It is also about the possibilities of what we can achieve when we push the limits of our imagination. It reminds us of the beauty in creation and the responsibility that comes with it. There is something profoundly human about the Golem. It is the embodiment of our highest aspirations and our deepest flaws. We create with the hope that we can shape the world around us in a way that will protect us, help us, and make us more than we are. But in that creation, we also reveal the very things that frighten us, the desire for control, the need for power, and the fear of being powerless. The Golem forces us to confront these fears head-on, to acknowledge that the things we create may not always act the way we expect them to. And yet, we continue to create. We continue to reach for the stars, to build and to shape the future, even when the shadows of the Golem loom large. Even in the world of entertainment, books, movies, games, the Golem's legacy remains alive. It is a figure that continues to capture our imagination, to serve as a metaphor for the dangers of unchecked power and the hope for redemption. The Golem is often portrayed in stories that speak to our need for control, our desire to protect what is ours, and our fear of what might happen when things go wrong. These stories resonate because they tap into something primal within us, the same fear and hope that has driven the Golem myth for centuries. But in these stories, there is also a lesson that echoes down through the ages. We must learn to respect the things we create. The Golem serves as a reminder that creation is a sacred act, that power must always be handled with care, and that there are consequences to what we build. The Golem is not just a story from the past. It is a living legend, a reflection of the world we live in today, a world where technology and power are growing at an exponential rate, where the boundaries of what is possible seem limitless, and where we must always ask ourselves, what is the cost of our creations? The Golem's legacy endures because it is a story about humanity itself, our struggles, our desires, our mistakes. It speaks to our deepest fears and our greatest hopes. It reminds us that, even in a world full of advanced technologies and new possibilities, the questions that the golem raises are as relevant as ever. Can we control what we create? Can we learn from the past? Can we use the power we wield for good, or will it slip beyond our grasp, becoming something we can no longer understand? And so, the golem stands, eternal, unyielding. Its presence is felt in the hum of machines, in the glow of screens, and in the quiet moments when we wonder, are we still in control? The golem is not just a relic of an ancient myth, it is a reflection of the human experience, a living legend that speaks to who we are, and who we might one day become. Its story will never truly end.